Picture, if you can, a photograph that was never quite taken, though it might have been, for the men in it stood together often enough. 3 cousins, 3 of the most powerful men who have ever lived. On the one side, the king of the British Empire, an empire so vast that the sun never set upon it, a quarter of all the people on earth, his subjects. In the middle, the German Kaiser, master of the mightiest army in Europe, and of a navy built to rival the greatest in the world. And on the other side, the Tsar of all the Russias, autocrat of 1/6 of the land on the face of the planet, answerable, he believed, to God alone. Between the 3 of them, these cousins, they ruled a good half of the world, and they were family. Not in some distant, ceremonial way, but truly, closely, warmly family. They had played together as boys. They had holidayed in the same houses, worn one another's uniforms as tokens of affection, danced at one another's weddings. They wrote to each other all their lives, in the same easy English they had learned in the same kind of schoolroom, and they signed those letters not with their titles but with the small names of the nursery, Georgie and Willy and Nicky, and behind them all stood the same little woman in black, the grandmother, or in one case the wife's grandmother, who had sat upon the British throne for longer than most of her subjects, had been alive, and who had married her children and her children's children into every court on the continent precisely so that Europe might become one great family, and being one family might never again go to war. That was the idea. That was the beautiful, reasonable, comforting idea. Hold it gently in your mind as we begin, because everything that follows is the long, slow story of how completely it failed. For within the span of only a few years, this family, the closest and the grandest the world had ever known, would preside over the bloodiest war the world had yet seen. 2 of these 3 cousins would lose everything they had. One of them, Nicky, would be woken in the dark in a cellar at the edge of Siberia and shot there with his wife and his children. Another, Willy, would flee across a border in the night and live out his long years in exile, an emperor without an empire, chopping wood in a foreign garden. 4 ancient empires would fall. The crowned heads who had filled every palace in Europe would be swept away, very nearly all of them, within a single lifetime. And the 3rd cousin, Georgie, the quiet one, the sailor, the one who kept his throne, would be left to preside over the wreckage of his own family, having made, somewhere along the way, one quiet decision about the cousin in the cellar that he would never afterwards speak of. How does that happen? How does the largest, most intimately connected family in the history of the world, a family that ruled the earth, a family whose whole purpose was to bind the nations together in blood and to keep the peace, how does such a family end by tearing itself and the world to pieces? How is it that the very men who might have stopped it, the cousins who genuinely loved one another, were the same men who signed the orders that sent it all into the fire? That is the story we are going to follow tonight, slowly and gently from the very beginning. There is nothing you need to hold on to, nothing you must remember in the morning. If you drift away somewhere among the palaces and the telegrams, let yourself go. That is exactly what this is for. And if you find that you enjoy these long, quiet journeys into the vanished past, you are welcome to subscribe, so that another may come and find you on another night. To understand how 3 cousins came to rule the world, and then to lose it, we must begin where they all in a sense began, with one small woman dressed in black, the grandmother who sat at the very centre of it all, and who believed, to the end of her long life, that a family could hold the peace of the world. Let us begin, gently, with a woman in black. Picture her small and stout and dressed in mourning that she would never once set aside, a widow for very nearly 40 years, seated at a writing desk by lamplight, a shawl about her shoulders, a pen moving steadily across the page. Her name was Victoria, and she was Queen of the United Kingdom, of Great Britain and Ireland, an Empress of India, and she had come to the throne as a girl of 18, roused from her bed one June morning to be told that her uncle, the king, had died in the night, and that the whole of that great empire now rested upon her. She would sit upon that throne for 63 years, longer than any English sovereign before her, until her reign felt less like the rule of one woman and more like a season of the world itself, an age that would come to bear her name. And in the beginning she had not been alone. Picture beside her in those early years a young man from a small German duchy, grave and handsome and rather serious, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, whom she had loved with her whole impetuous heart from almost the first moment she saw him. They were married in the winter of 1840, and it was, by every measure we have, the letters, the diaries, the small tendernesses recorded and remembered, a genuine love match, which was no small or ordinary thing for a queen. Together, over the years that followed, they had 9 children. 9, 4 sons and 5 daughters, born across 2 decades into the nurseries of Buckingham Palace and Windsor, and the house they built for themselves by the sea, at Osborne, on the Isle of Wight, a great, warm, boisterous, quarrelsome brood of princes and princesses, raised half in the formality of a court, and half in the ordinary muddle of any large family. And here is the quiet thing that would change the shape of a continent. For Albert, that serious and thoughtful man, had an idea, and Victoria came to share it. And after his early death she carried it forward as though it were a sacred trust laid upon her. The idea was this, that these 9 children, and in time their children, and their children's children, ought to be married, carefully, deliberately, one by one, into the royal and princely houses of Europe. Not for love, though love sometimes came, and not merely for advantage, though advantage was surely reckoned, but for something larger. For if the thrones of Europe could be woven together by blood, if every crowned head on the continent could be made, in time, a cousin or a nephew or a son-in-law of every other, then perhaps, this was the hope, the great and tender hope of it, perhaps Europe might become a single family. And a family surely would not go to war with itself, so the marriages were made. The eldest daughter, another Victoria, was sent to Prussia to marry the man who would become the German emperor, and she carried her mother's blood into the very heart of Berlin. Another daughter went to Hesse, in the German middle country, another to a duke's house that reached toward Russia. The sons married princesses of Denmark and of Russia and of the small German states. And as the grandchildren came, and there were, in the end, more than 40 of them, they too were placed, like carefully chosen pieces, upon a wide and gleaming board, into Greece and Romania, and Spain and Sweden and Norway, into Hesse and Prussia and the imperial court of the Tsars. In time you could scarcely find a throne in Europe that did not, somewhere in its family tree, come home to that small woman in black at her writing desk. They called her, and they called her rightly, with real and literal accuracy, the grandmother of Europe. When she wrote her letters, and she wrote a great many, hundreds and hundreds of them, in a firm underlined hand, she was writing, quite often, to emperors and empresses and kings and queens who were also, and first simply her grandchildren, to be scolded and advised and fussed over and loved. She remembered their birthdays. She worried over their health and their marriages and their quarrels. She sent them advice they did not always want and gifts they treasured, and she kept in her head the whole vast branching map of who had married whom, and who was expecting a child, and who was not on speaking terms with whom, the way any grandmother keeps the shape of her family, only that this family happened to hold the fate of a continent in its hands. And so imagine it, in those long golden summers before the century turned, the great houses of that family gathered on the lawns at Windsor, or walking the gardens at Osborne with the sea beyond, or come together in their dark coats and their high collars for a wedding, or a christening, or a jubilee, nurses and governesses moving among a crowd of small cousins who spoke to one another, very often in the same easy English, because So many of their mothers were English princesses, and English was the language of the nursery, even in Berlin, even sometimes in the palaces of St. Petersburg. They gave one another the soft, foolish, affectionate names that families give, the pet names of childhood that would follow these particular children, astonishingly, all the way to their thrones and beyond. It seemed for a while, exactly as Albert had dreamed it, that the whole of Europe was simply one large and rather quarrelsome family, and that a family, whatever its squabbles, would always in the end draw back from the edge. Now let me set 3 of those thrones before you, for it is around 3 of them that our story will turn. 3 grandsons, or near enough, of that age, who would grow up to rule the greatest empires the world had yet seen. There was the British Empire, upon which, as the saying went, the sun never set, a quarter of the earth and a quarter of its people bound to a small island in the Northern Sea. And in our story, its king would be George V, a plain and steady man, a sailor, before he was a sovereign, with the beard and the bearing of a naval officer, who had never expected to be king at all and came to the crown almost by accident of death. Remember him at the centre of what follows. There was the German Empire, young and proud and enormously strong, an empire scarcely older than the men who ruled it, forged out of many German states within living memory, its factories roaring, its army the wonder and the dread of the continent, its new navy rising to challenge Britain's own upon the sea. And over it sat the Kaiser Wilhelm II, brilliant and restless and wounded, a man of quick enthusiasms and sudden angers, forever reaching, it seemed, for a respect he feared was being withheld. And there was the empire of all the Russias, vast beyond easy imagining, stretching from the borders of Germany across the whole breadth of Asia to the shores of the Pacific, a realm of forests and steppe and frozen rivers, of 100 peoples and 100 tongues, ruled as no Western king dared any longer to rule, by the single, unquestioned will of one man. And that man was Nicholas II, gentle in his manners, devoted to his wife and his children, and burdened, as few men have ever been burdened, by a crown he did not truly know how to wear. George, Wilhelm, Nicholas, 3 thrones, 3 empires, and a family knot binding them together, that I want to draw for you slowly, and truly, exactly as it was, because the truth of it is stranger and lovelier, and more tangled than the easy telling. Begin with George and place him at the very centre of the web, for that is where he belongs. George V was a first cousin, a true close first cousin, of both of the other 2 men, and he came to each of them by an entirely different road. He was first cousin to Kaiser Wilhelm because both of them were grandsons of Queen Victoria. George, through his father, Victoria's son, Wilhelm through his mother, Victoria's eldest daughter, the princess who had gone to Berlin. So down one branch of that great tree, George and Wilhelm were bound, Victoria's blood in both of them, the grandmother of Europe, their shared grandmother. But George was first cousin to Tsar Nicholas by another road entirely, one that had nothing to do with Victoria at all. For George's mother and Nicholas's mother were sisters, 2 princesses of Denmark, 2 daughters of the Danish king, one of whom had married into Britain and one into Russia. And that is why, when George and Nicholas stood side by side, as they sometimes did, grown men in their uniforms, the resemblance between them was so uncanny that strangers mistook the one for the other. The same trim beard, the same eyes, the same set of the face. For their mothers had been sisters, and the 2 cousins had inherited, across 2 hostile empires, very nearly the same face. And the Kaiser and the Tsar, Wilhelm and Nicholas, what of the 2 of them, the German and the Russian? Here we must be careful and honest, for this is the place where the easy story goes wrong. Wilhelm and Nicholas were cousins too, yes, but only distant ones by blood. Their common ancestors set far back up the branches, the sort of cousinhood that half the crowned heads of Europe could claim of one another. By blood alone the tie between them was thin. But the knot was pulled tight another way, pulled tight once again through Queen Victoria. For Nicholas had married, for love, a German princess of Hesse named Alexandra, Alex to her family, and Alexandra was herself a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, one of the daughters of that daughter who had gone to Hesse, and Wilhelm was Alexandra's first cousin. So the Kaiser and the Tsar, distant enough in their own blood, were bound close all the same, because the Tsar's own wife was first cousin to the German Kaiser and granddaughter to the old Queen in England. Hold it in your mind, then, that whole intricate and gleaming web, and do not trouble to hold every strand, only the shape of it. George at the centre, first cousin to the Kaiser on one side, and first cousin to the Tsar on the other. The Tsar's wife, first cousin to the Kaiser, and granddaughter to Victoria. 3 thrones, 3 empires, one enormous and elaborate family, cousins and cousins' wives and cousins' cousins, all of them threaded back, again and again, to that small woman in black at her writing desk, who had believed with her whole heart that this was how peace was made. And here, before we go on, before we come to these 3 men one at a time, to the boys they were and the rulers they became, which is a telling for the chapters still ahead, here is the thing you must carry with you into the dark. It is the quiet, terrible irony at the heart of everything that follows, and it is worth saying softly, and once, and letting it settle. This family, this most interconnected family in the whole history of the world, bound by more marriages and more blood and more careful, deliberate, loving arrangement than any dynasty that had ever lived. This family, which had been woven together across 3 generations for the express and tender purpose of making war between its members unthinkable, would within a single generation, within the span of these 3 cousins' own lives, preside over the most destructive war that the world had yet seen. The insurance policy would fail. The cousins who had played on their grandmother's lawns, who wrote to one another in the same schoolroom English, who signed themselves with the pet names of childhood, would find themselves standing at the head of vast armies, pointed at one another's hearts, and all the letters and all the affection and all the shared blood in the world would not be enough to hold the guns silent. A family ruled the world, and a family could not save it. But that is to run ahead of ourselves, and there is time enough and more for all of it. For now the old Queen is still living, still writing her letters by lamplight, still gathering her grandchildren about her in the long light of the summer evenings. The children are still children. The century has not yet turned, and to understand how 3 cousins came to break the world, we must first go back and meet each of them as a boy, beginning, when you're ready, with the plainest and the steadiest of the 3, the sailor prince who never thought to be a king. Let us go, gently now, to a winter morning in Berlin, to the year 1859, to a bedroom in the old palace where the great clocks were kept, and where a young mother, not yet 19, lay in a labour that had gone on far too long. Picture the room as it must have been, heavy with the smell of tallow and antiseptic, thick with the fear that no one dared to speak aloud, and imagine the doctors bent over her, and the midwives moving quietly, and the child, the first child, refusing to be born in the way that children are meant to be born. It was what the physicians of that age called a breech birth. The baby turned the wrong way about, so that the little feet came first and the head came last, and in the long and frightening struggle to bring him safely into the world, something in his small left arm was torn. Some bundle of nerves at the shoulder stretched and broken, so that the arm would never again do quite what an arm is supposed to do. We would give it a name today. That injury, we would call it Erb's palsy, a damage to the nerves of the shoulder that leaves the limb weak and turned inward. And we would say, with the calm of hindsight, that both mother and child had very nearly died that day, and that only the greatest good fortune had spared them at all. But there was no such calm in the room that morning. There was only the raw relief of a living child, and a mother's exhausted joy, and unseen for a little while yet, the quiet beginning of a wound that would shape a man, and through that man, perhaps, shaped the fate of the world. His name was Wilhelm. Wilhelm II he would one day be called, though for now he was only a baby, and to those who loved him he would soon be Willy, the small warm name that clings to a boy all his life, even after he has grown too grand for it. And the arm, that poor damaged arm, grew, but it did not grow as its brother did. The right arm filled out, strong and ordinary, the arm of any healthy boy, but the left stayed thin and short and turned a little in upon itself, weak at the hand, unwilling at the shoulder, an arm that could not lift, could not grip with any real strength, could not do the small unthinking things that the rest of us never pause to be grateful for. And here is a thing to hold in your mind, softly, as you lie there in the dark, for it will matter to everything that follows. A prince, the heir to a warrior kingdom, a kingdom that prized above all things the upright soldier, the man in uniform sitting straight upon his horse, was born with a body that would not let him be, in the eyes of that world, entirely whole. And he knew it. From his earliest awareness he knew it, and he would spend the whole long theatre of his life arranging himself so that no one else quite would. He learned to hold the withered hand still at his side, or to rest it upon the hilt of a sword, or to lay it in a photograph, upon a cane or a table, or to grip a pair of white gloves in it, so that the fingers seemed to have a purpose. Picture that. A little boy already learning to hide, already learning that a part of himself must be managed and concealed, and you begin to understand the ache that lived beneath all his later noise. Now let us turn to his mother, for she is the heart of this, and she is one of the most poignant figures in the whole tangled story of these cousins. She was Victoria, Princess Victoria, called Vicky within the family, and she was the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria of England, the first child of that famous marriage, clever beyond the ordinary, quick and warm and headstrong, raised by her adoring father to think, to question, to believe in progress and liberty and the gentle improving power of reason. And she had been sent, at 17, from the England she loved to the Prussia she was to make her home, married to the Prussian crown prince, carried off to a court that was stiff and military and suspicious of her English ways, her English books, her English opinions, her English habit of saying what she thought. Imagine her there, this bright young English woman among the grey Prussian generals, homesick in her bones for the soft green country of her childhood, for her mother's houses, for the sea light and the manners of home, and determined, fiercely and lovingly determined, that her firstborn son would be raised in the enlightened English mould, a liberal prince, a good and modern man. And then that son was born with a ruined arm, and something in her, some tenderness, twisted by guilt, could not bear it. For she blamed herself, you see, quietly and terribly, as mothers in that age were taught to do, and she could not accept that the arm would never heal. And so she gave her boy over to the doctors, to cure by cure, treatment upon treatment, each one offered as hope, and each one to the child a small ordeal. Picture the animal flesh wraps, the arm of a boy bound up inside the warm carcass of a freshly killed hare, in the belief that the animal warmth might feed life back into the limb. Picture the electrical machines, the wires and the sponges, the shocks sent buzzing through the weak muscles twice a week to make them twitch and work. A small child sitting still and brave while the current bit at him. Picture, most piercing of all, the good and healthy right arm being strapped tight against his body, tied down and made useless for hours, so that the boy would be forced to reach and struggle with the withered one, to feed himself, to steady himself, to do everything with the very arm that could least be trusted to do it. There were machines to straighten his neck, which had grown crooked, a dreadful contraption that held his head in place with a screw. None of it worked, none of it could have worked, and through all of it his mother watched and hoped and grieved, believing she was helping him, and the boy endured it and loved her, and somewhere beneath the love a small cold seed of resentment was planted that neither of them would ever fully name. And so imagine the mind that grew up out of all this, for it is a mind worth understanding gently, without cruelty, because so much would one day turn upon it. He was, in truth, a clever boy, quick and curious, with a real charm when he chose to spend it, a gift for languages, a hunger for every kind of knowledge, a memory that dazzled the tutors set over him. But laid all through that brightness, like a flaw running through good stone, was a deep and restless insecurity, a need to be admired that could never quite be filled. He was proud, easily and loudly proud, and he was thin-skinned beneath the pride, quick to feel slighted, quick to wound others when he felt wounded himself, given to sudden enthusiasms and sudden sulks, to bluster that covered fear, to a kind of showing off that was really a plea. Here was a young man who wanted, more than almost anything, to be thought strong, precisely because some hidden part of him was so sure that he was not. And when a boy who has been made to feel weak grows up with the power to command armies and empires, the world would do well to watch him carefully. But that is for later. For now, hold only the boy himself, and the strange twist of tenderness and hurt that his mother's love had become. For his feeling toward her was never simple, and never would be. He loved her, this English mother, with a child's fierce need, and yet he came to resent her too. Resent her cool disappointment, her endless correcting, her way of measuring him against a standard he could never reach, and resent, perhaps, the very fact that he could not be the whole and perfect son she had so plainly longed for. And that tangle of love and resentment reached out beyond her and fastened itself upon the country she came from, upon England itself. For England, to young Willy, was his mother's homeland and his grandmother's kingdom. And his grandmother was Queen Victoria of England, the small, stout, black-clad woman who sat at the very centre of the family, grandmother to half the royal houses of Europe. He worshipped her, this grandmother, worshipped her rank and her grandeur, and the vast, serene power of the empire she embodied. And he loved to go to England, to the great houses, to Windsor, to the Isle of Wight, to the summer lawns and the smell of the sea. And yet he never felt that England quite accepted him, this half-English grandson with the German uniform, and the damaged arm, and the too loud manner. And admiration soured slowly into envy, and envy tangled itself back into love, so that all his life he would circle England, the way a lonely boy circles the friends who will not quite let him in, longing to be one of them, and hating a little that he could not be. So there it is, the shape of him, forming in the long years of his boyhood and his youth. Picture him growing tall, learning to ride, mastering with fierce willpower the horse that a one-armed rider had every reason to fear, driving himself to shoot and to sail and to command, always pressing against the limit of the body that had betrayed him, always needing to prove that the withered arm had not diminished him. Picture him in the uniforms he came so to love, the high collars and the polished boots, the helmet with its gleaming point, standing very straight for the painters and the photographers, the bad arm arranged just so, the good hand resting on the sword. Picture the young man at the university, brilliant in flashes, restless, opinionated, charming a room 1 hour and offending it the next, a young man of dazzling promise and unsteady judgment, whose mood swung like a weather vane, whose confidence was a bright coat worn over something cold and uncertain beneath. Already, if you knew where to look, you could see the volatility that would one day sit behind the German throne, the impulsiveness, the craving for applause, the swift temper, the wounded pride dressed up as strength. And you might have thought, watching him then, that so much would depend, one distant day, upon whether this particular young man could master himself, or whether he never quite would. And here, in the quiet of this hour, let the great and sorrowful theme settle over you once more, softly, the way a shadow lengthens across a lawn at evening. These children, these grandchildren of the old queen, were bound together by blood, cousin to cousin across the courts of Europe, raised in the same nurseries, kissed by the same grandmother, dressed as boys in one another's sailor suits, so that it seemed the surest thing in the world that a family so joined could never let itself come to harm. A family ruled the world, in those years, sat upon its thrones, and wore its crowns and commanded its fleets and its regiments. and a family, when the darkness finally came, could not save it. Willy was one of those children, the boy with the withered arm, and the English mother, and the aching, envious love of his grandmother's island, and he was growing, in these unhurried years, into the man who would one day wear the German crown. But that crown is not yet his. His grandfather still lives, and his father still stands before him in the line, and the great questions of empire and iron and the sea are still, for now, far off. For the moment there is only the young man himself, brilliant and bruised, proud and unsure, learning to ride and to command and to hide the arm he cannot bear the world to see, carrying within him all the tenderness and all the hurt that would one day help to steer an empire toward the storm. Let him rest there a while, in the last long light of his youth. There is time yet in this quiet telling, before the weight of the world comes down upon those uncertain shoulders. And so we leave him for now, and let our thoughts drift gently on toward the others, the cousins across the water and across the eastern plains, whose stories were being woven in these same years into the same slow and gathering fate. Settle for a moment now, and let your thoughts drift back across more than a century to a world of gaslight and slow trains, of long summers on green English lawns and pale winter afternoons in St. Petersburg, and let me tell you, very gently, about two young men who were cousins, and who were so alike that even the people who loved them best could not always tell them apart. Their names were George and Nicholas. Georgie and Nicky, they called each other, in the soft, private way that families keep for one another, the way you might have a name that only your own people ever use, a name that carries with it the whole warmth of childhood. One of them was a prince of Britain, a grandson of the old queen, and he would one day be crowned George V. The other was the heir to all the Russias, the Tsarevich, and he would one day be crowned Nicholas II. But that is getting ahead of the story, and this is a slow story, meant to be heard with your eyes already closed. For now, they are simply two young men, neither of them loud, neither of them hungry for power, both of them fonder of quiet rooms and family dinners and small ordinary pleasures than of anything so heavy as a throne. To understand why they were so close, you have to go back a little further still to a small kingdom by the cold northern sea, to Denmark, for at the very heart of the whole story, threading it together like a single quiet ribbon, are two sisters, two princesses of Denmark, born into a family that was not especially rich and not especially grand, but that would, in the space of a single generation, send its children out to sit beside the great thrones of Europe. Two sisters, that is the whole secret of it. Georgie and Nicky were so close because their mothers were sisters, and had loved each other as girls, and went on loving each other as women across all the distance that queens and empresses are supposed to keep. The elder of the two sisters was named Alexandra. She left Denmark as a young woman to marry the Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Queen Victoria, and so she became the Princess of Wales, and in the fullness of time she would be a Queen of England. And Alexandra was George's mother. Picture her, if you like, a graceful and gentle woman with a soft voice, devoted to her children, keeping about her always a little of the plainness and the family warmth of her Danish girlhood, so that her son George grew up in a home that felt, for all its grandeur, more like a close and affectionate family than a royal court. The younger sister was named Dagmar, and her path led east, far east, all the way to Russia, to the vast and glittering and rather frightening empire of the Tsars. There she married Alexander III, the great broad-shouldered giant of a man who would rule Russia with an iron steadiness. And on marrying into that world, she took a new name, as brides in the Russian church did, and she became the Empress Marie Feodorovna. Remember that name, spoken so, Marie Feodorovna, for it is the same laughing Danish girl, Dagmar, only dressed now in the heavy jewels of an empire that stretched from the Baltic almost to the Pacific. And Marie Feodorovna, Dagmar, was Nicholas's mother. So there it is, the simple and rather beautiful fact at the root of everything. Two sisters, from Denmark, Alexandra and Dagmar, one gone west to England, one gone east to Russia, each with a gentle son, and those two sons first cousins, bound together, not by politics or treaty, but by the oldest and warmest thing there is, by blood, by the love of two sisters who wanted their boys to know one another. The mothers wrote to each other constantly and visited when they could, and brought their children together, and so from their earliest years, George and Nicholas were not distant royal relations who met at ceremonies, but true cousins, playmates, friends, and you must understand how unusual that was in that world at that height. The families that ruled the great empires were often knit together on paper, cousin to cousin, house to house, in a vast and tangled web of marriages arranged for reasons of state, so that a man might have 100 royal relations scattered across the map and feel no more for any of them than you might feel for a name in a distant ledger. But this was not that. This was warm. This was real. The two sisters had grown up together in the same modest rooms in Copenhagen, close in age and closer still in heart, and when life sent them off to their separate thrones, they did not let go of one another, and they did not let their sons grow into strangers. They saw to it that Georgie and Nicky knew the sound of each other's voices, the shape of each other's humour, the small shared jokes that only children who have played together can keep. And so, quite apart from all the grandeur, there ran between these two young men a thread of ordinary family love, the kind that has nothing to do with crowns, the kind you might recognise from your own life, from a cousin you saw each summer and loved without ever quite thinking about why. And now I must tell you the strangest thing of all, the thing that gives this friendship its almost dreamlike quality. For these two cousins did not merely love one another, they looked alike, not in the ordinary way that cousins sometimes share a nose or a way of laughing, but so completely, so uncannily, that people who had known both of them for years would still, now and then, mistake the one for the other. Imagine it. The same neat build, the same careful bearing, the same short beard trimmed close in the fashion of the day, and above the beard the same quiet, mild, rather melancholy eyes. Put a photograph of the young George beside a photograph of the young Nicholas, and you would have to look twice, and then a third time, and even then you might not be sure which gentle face belonged to the future King of England, and which to the future Tsar of all the Russias. They were not twins, they were cousins, born in different countries, more than 3 years apart, and yet the word that people reached for again and again was that word, twins. The cousins who might have been twins. It was a thing they knew about themselves and were amused by, and it followed them through their lives like a small private joke, shared between two men who found so much else to share. The most famous time the world got itself thoroughly tangled in that resemblance came in the autumn of the year 1894. Let me set the scene for you softly, for it is a scene worth resting in. Nicholas was to be married. He was to take as his bride a princess of Germany, Alix of Hesse, and the wedding would be held in St. Petersburg in the cold, clear light of a Russian November. And George, ever the devoted cousin, travelled all the long way east to stand beside Nicky on his wedding day, as family does, as family should. Now picture the great palaces of St. Petersburg filled with the assembled royalty of Europe, the gold and the candlelight, the crowds of guests in their finery, all of them come to see the young Tsarevich married, and moving among them two young bearded men who looked, to any glancing eye, very nearly identical. You can guess what happened, and it happened again and again, all through those days. Guests would approach George, bow, and begin to offer their congratulations to the groom, before someone gently corrected them. Others, seeing Nicholas, took him for his English cousin. There were those who could not be sure which of the two was the bridegroom himself, and which the visiting prince from England, so that poor George found himself more than once being congratulated on a wedding that was not his own, and being mistaken for the master of a country that was not his to rule. It is worth being careful here, because the story is so charming that it sometimes gets told a little wrong and set at George's own wedding instead. But no, it was Nicky's wedding in St. Petersburg in that November of 1894, where the confusion ran thickest, where the two faces blurred so completely in the eyes of the guests that the cousins became, for a few strange and rather delightful days, almost interchangeable. And one imagines the two of them, at the end of such a day, catching each other's eye across a crowded room and sharing a quiet, private laugh at the whole absurdity of it. Two gentle men who had long since grown used to being taken for one another. But I would not have you think their bond was only a matter of matching faces, for that would be to miss the truer and softer thing about it. The resemblance was the outward sign. The real likeness lay deeper in temperament, in the very grain of who they were. For George and Nicholas were alike, not only in their features, but in their natures. Both were quiet men. Both were shy in their way, more at ease in a small circle of family than in the glare of great occasions. Both were dutiful, conscientious, anxious to do the right thing, a little burdened by the sense of what was expected of them. Both loved order and routine and the small comforts of a settled domestic life. Both, above all, were devoted to their families, to their parents, and their brothers and sisters, and later to wives and children of their own. They were, in the deepest sense, home-loving men, and so they wrote to one another, across the whole width of Europe, with a fondness that is very touching to overhear. Georgie and Nicky, their letters begin, and the affection in them is real and unforced, the affection of two men who genuinely liked each other, who trusted each other, who felt when they were together the particular ease that comes only from being with someone who understands you without your having to explain. When they met, which was not as often as either of them would have wished, they fell at once into that easy companionship, the shooting and the walking and the long unhurried talk of men who ask nothing of each other but company. Sketch them for yourself, then, as they were in those young years before the great weights descended. Neither of them had been born quite expecting the enormous thing that would one day come to rest upon his shoulders. Each had grown up with a certain space around him, a certain freedom to be an ordinary devoted son, a younger figure in a large family, not yet marked out as the one who must carry everything. And in truth, by every gentle instinct of their natures, both of them were far better suited to a country house than to a throne. Picture George happiest with a gun over his arm on a misty English morning, or bent for hours over the albums of his beloved stamps, a patient, orderly, unhurried man who wanted little more than a quiet home and a loving family about him. Picture Nicholas the same, drawn always to the domestic and the calm, longing above all for a simple family happiness, uneasy in the vast machinery of the empire that would one day be his to steer. There is something almost tender and something almost sorrowful in seeing them so, these two mild cousins, so alike in face and in feeling, neither of them made for the heights to which they were born. For here is the strange truth that sits quietly beneath this whole long story, and I will only set it before you once, and gently, and let it rest. A family ruled the world, and a family could not save it. These were not distant strangers who happened to command the great empires. They were cousins, they were kin, they were two Danish sisters' gentle sons who wrote each other loving letters and were mistaken for one another at a wedding, and who between them, and with others of their blood, held in their hands more power than almost any men who had ever lived. And that, in the end, is the ache at the centre of everything that is to come. But we are not there yet, and there is no need to hurry toward it. For now, let the two of them stay young. Let George be simply Georgie, and Nicholas be simply Nicky, two quiet cousins so alike that the world confused them, bound by their mother's sisterhood, fonder of home than of glory, writing their warm letters back and forth across the miles, neither of them yet knowing quite how heavy the crowns would prove, nor how far apart the years would one day carry them. Rest there with them a while, in that gentler time, before the story moves on, as slowly and as softly it now begins to do. Let us stay a while with the boy who would be called Willy, and follow him softly into the years when the world set a crown upon his head. For there is a strange thing about the year 1888, a year that Germany would remember ever after as the year of the three emperors. And it is worth resting in that year for a moment, the way you might rest your hand on the cover of an old book before you open it. Picture the winter turning slowly towards spring, and in the old palace in Berlin, an ancient man lying at the end of a very long life. This was Wilhelm I, the first German emperor, the grandfather, a soldier king from another age, who had watched his kingdom of Prussia grow, almost against his own cautious instincts, into a mighty empire that stretched across the heart of Europe. He was more than 90 years old. He had seen more of history than any man around him, and in March of 1888, quietly, in the way that even emperors must, he died. And so the throne passed to his son. His son was Frederick, who now became Frederick III. And here the story turns gentle and sorrowful at once, for Frederick was, by all the accounts that have come down to us, a decent and liberal-minded man, a man who believed in parliaments and in reason and in a softer, more open kind of Germany than the one the soldiers around him wished to build. And he was married to an Englishwoman, to Victoria, the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria of England, a princess called Vicky within the family, clever and warm and English to her bones. Together, they had dreamed for years of the good they might do when at last their turn came to rule. But their turn came too late, and it came cruelly. For Frederick ascended the throne, already dying, his throat ravaged by cancer, unable, at the end, even to speak, so that he ruled through notes scribbled on a pad of paper, a silent emperor. He reigned for about 99 days, only that. A single summer's fraction of a reign measured not in years but in the slow, failing breaths of a good man, and then in June, he too was gone. And so in June of 1888, the crown came down at last upon the head of the young man we have been following since he was a boy on his grandmother's lawns. Wilhelm II, German Emperor and King of Prussia, was 29 years old. 29. Imagine it. Imagine standing at that age with the withered arm you had carried since birth held carefully at your side, and feeling the whole weight of an empire settle onto your shoulders in the space of a single, strange spring. Your grandfather dead in March, your father dead in June, and you, the grandson, the son, suddenly the master of the most powerful army on the continent, sovereign of 60 million people, an emperor with the whole restless future of Germany waiting on your word. It would have turned a steadier head than his, for Wilhelm was not steady. He was quick and clever and hungry for admiration, and he had within him a strange jangling energy that could never quite settle into rest. And almost at once in these first years, he showed the world the shape of the man he would be. For standing beside the young Kaiser, filling the whole horizon like a mountain, was the old Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, the towering figure who had, more than any other single man, made the German Empire itself, who had stitched it together out of quarrelling kingdoms with what men called blood and iron, and who had then, in the long years afterward, kept the peace of Europe balanced upon his fingertips with a patience and a cunning that no one else could match. Bismarck was old now, and heavy, and used to being obeyed. He had served the grandfather for a lifetime. He fully expected to guide the grandson as well, to be the wise old pilot at the helm, while the young emperor learned the sea. But the young emperor did not wish to be guided. He wished to steer the ship himself. And so, in 1890, after a long and bitter struggle of wills between the boy of 30 and the man of 75, Wilhelm pushed Bismarck aside, accepted, or rather demanded his resignation, and sent the great old Chancellor away into a resentful retirement. It was one of the most fateful partings of the age, and it was captured, at the time, in a famous drawing that showed the old man in his heavy coat climbing down the ladder from a great ship, while the young monarch leaned over the rail and watched him go. The pilot, the picture said, the pilot dropped. And in a way it was true, truer than anyone yet understood. The one hand that had known how to hold all the tangled threads of European peace together, gently, without pulling any of them taut. That hand was now gone from the wheel, and a younger, rasher, far less patient hand had taken its place. And what a restless hand it was. For Wilhelm, once he ruled in earnest, could not sit still. He wanted Germany to be great, and not merely great at home, in the old careful Bismarckian way, but great across the whole wide world. He wanted, as he and his ministers began to say, a place in the sun, colonies and influence, and a voice in every far quarter of the earth, from Africa to China to the warm blue Pacific. He looked out at the older empires, at France with her possessions, and above all at Britain, his own grandmother's England, with her vast dominions upon which, men said, the sun never set, and something in him ached to have the same, to be reckoned their equal, to be feared and admired as they were feared and admired. And so he set his heart, above all, upon a navy, a great navy, a fleet of iron battleships to rival the fleet that Britain had ruled the oceans with for 100 years. Germany already had the finest army in the world. Now she would build ships to match, ship for ship, gun for gun, and challenge Britain upon the very sea that Britain thought of as her own. It was a fateful ambition, and it did a quiet, terrible damage that Wilhelm, in his eagerness, never fully saw. For nothing could have frightened and hardened the English more surely than a rival fleet rising across the narrow water of the North Sea. An island lives by its navy. An island fears, above all things, another power that reaches for the waves. And so, year by year, keel by keel, this naval arms race between Germany and Britain went on. Each new German battleship answered by 2 British ones. Each answered again, the 2 nations pouring their treasure into steel and steadily, without ever quite meaning to, teaching one another to see an enemy where once there had been only cousins. The very country of his grandmother, the England he loved, Wilhelm was slowly turning, through this hunger for a fleet, into the one great power arrayed against him. And that is the heart of the sadness in him, and we must sit with it gently, for it is the truest thing about the man. Wilhelm was clever. He truly was. He had a fine, darting mind, a real gift for languages, a genuine energy that could light up a room, a curiosity about ships and machines and armies and art. Men who met him were often dazzled at first, and yet, again and again, all of it was undone by his vanity, by his need to be admired, by a volatility of temper that swung from delight to fury and back within an hour, and by a fatal careless gift for the wounding remark. He could not resist saying the clever cutting thing, the boastful thing, the tactless thing. He gave interviews that alarmed half of Europe. He sent messages that insulted the very men he most needed as friends. He would rattle his sword and preen and make grand speeches full of thunder, and then be genuinely bewildered and hurt when the world drew back from him in alarm. He wanted more than anything to be loved and respected, and he behaved, more often than not, in exactly the way most certain to lose him love and respect. There was something almost boyish in it, and something tragic, a man of real gifts forever tripping over his own longing to be seen as great. And nowhere did that longing run deeper or ache more sharply than in the matter of England. For here we come back, as this whole story keeps coming back, to the family. Remember who he was. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria, the eldest grandson, the child of her English daughter Vicky. He was nephew to the pleasure-loving, worldly Prince of Wales, the man who would one day be King Edward VII, his Uncle Bertie. The English royal family was his family, half of him. He had English blood and an English mother, and English memories of those summers by the sea. And he loved them, in his strange contorted way, loved England, admired the English, longed all his life to be embraced by them as one of their own, to be taken seriously by them, to win from them the warm approval he never quite believed he had. And yet in the same breath he resented them. He half worshipped the English and half hated them, and could never untangle the two. He felt always that they looked down on him, that his glamorous uncle Bertie thought him a tiresome, tactless boy, that the whole assured, easy English world regarded him as an upstart, a nephew to be humoured rather than an emperor to be honoured, and that wound never healed. It sat in him for the whole of his life, that unfinished quarrel of the heart, love and rivalry twisted together, so that he could never simply be at peace with the country he most wished to be loved by. Here, if anywhere, you can feel the deep, sorrowful truth that runs beneath this whole tale, that a family ruled the world, the thrones of Europe filled with grandmothers and cousins and uncles and nephews, all bound by blood, and yet a family in the end could not save it, could not save even itself, from the slow drift toward the dark. But let us not leave him only with his vanity, for there is a truer, tenderer picture to hold, and it belongs to a cold January in the year 1901. In that month, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, Queen Victoria lay dying. The old Queen, the grandmother of them all, the still centre around whom the whole royal family of Europe had turned for longer than most of them had been alive. And when Wilhelm heard that she was failing, the restless, boastful, difficult Kaiser dropped everything and hurried across to England to be with her. He set aside all his grandeur and came simply as a grandson coming to his grandmother's bedside. And he was there at the end, in that quiet room with the family gathered close and the light failing outside. It was Wilhelm, the German emperor, who knelt and helped to hold the small, frail old queen in his arms as she died, supporting her, cradling her for hours, so that she passed from the world held in part by the very grandson who would one day be counted her enemy's enemy. Picture that if you can, and let it soften everything you have heard of him. The man who wanted a navy to challenge her empire, the man forever aching for England's respect, holding his English grandmother gently against himself as her long life ran out, tears on his face, no emperor in that moment at all, only a boy who had loved her. It is the truest glimpse we have of the heart beneath the bluster, divided, longing, tender, and quite unable to see where all his restlessness was carrying him and the world he half ruled. For the years were turning, quietly, all this while. The ships kept rising in their yards. The old queen was gone now, and her worldly son sat on the English throne, and the young cousins had become the grave men who held the great empires in their hands. And out ahead of them, still far off, still unimagined on those calm nights, the century was gathering itself toward a summer none of them could yet see. But that is a later part of the story, and it can wait. For now, let the young Kaiser stand where we have found him, crowned too soon, gifted and wounded, master of a mighty new empire, and prisoner of his own divided heart. And let us breathe and rest, and go on softly from here. Now let your thoughts drift eastward, away from the sea, away from the shipyards and the parade grounds, out across the great cold breadth of Russia, to the third of our three cousins, and to a young man who, of all of them, wanted the crown the least. His name was Nicholas II, though before he was anything so grand, he was only Nicky, a slight and a gentle young man with soft eyes and a soft voice, the eldest son of a father who seemed to have been carved from stone. And to understand Nicky, you must first, for just a moment, picture that father, Alexander III, the Tsar of all the Russias, a giant of a man, broad as a doorway, strong enough, they said, to bend an iron poker in his bare hands, a ruler who filled every room he entered and who governed his vast empire the way he governed his household, absolutely, without doubt, without apology. Beside such a father, the boy Nicholas seemed small and quiet and unformed, and no one, least of all Nicholas himself, imagined that the day of his own reign would come soon. Alexander was strong. Alexander was in the prime of his life. There was, everyone assumed, a great stretch of years still ahead. Years in which the son might slowly, gently, be made ready for the weight that would one day fall on him. But time, as it so often does, did not keep to the plan that everyone had quietly agreed upon. In the autumn of 1894, that mountain of a man, that Tsar who seemed as permanent as the land itself, sickened and began to fail. He was not yet 50. His kidneys were giving way, and no doctor and no prayer and no power on earth could turn it back. And so at a palace in the Crimea, near the warm southern sea, with his family gathered close around him, Alexander III died, suddenly far too young and far too soon for the shy son who now, in a single afternoon, in the space of a few quiet breaths, became the master of 1/6 of the surface of the whole earth. Picture that moment, if you would, and picture it tenderly, for it is one of the most human moments in this whole long story. Nicholas was 26. He had lost his father, whom he loved and feared, and had never once thought to question, and in the very same hour he had been handed the most autocratic throne in all of Europe, a throne answerable to no parliament, checked by no constitution, bound by nothing but the conscience of the man who sat upon it. And this young man, this gentle young man, turned to one of his cousins, and with tears in his eyes he confided the thing that was truly in his heart. He did not know how to be a Tsar. He had never wanted to be one. He knew nothing, he said, of the business of ruling. He had never even been allowed to sit in on the councils of state. What was going to happen now, he asked, to him and to Russia? It is a quiet thing to say, and an ordinary thing, the sort of thing any frightened young man might say to someone he trusted, and yet remember where he was standing when he said it. Behind him lay 130 million souls, more people than any other monarch in Europe could name as his own, scattered across a land so wide that when the sun rose over its western border, it had not yet set on the eastern one. Every one of those lives in the strange and ancient theory of the Russian crown was in some sense his to answer for, and he had just told his cousin, honestly, with a breaking heart, that he did not know how. Hold that in your mind gently as we go on, because it is the truest single thing about Nicholas II, truer than any decree he would ever sign, that from the very first hour he carried the immense, rigid, ancient autocracy of Russia the way a man carries a weight he never asked to lift, a weight laid across his shoulders by the mere accident of his birth and the cruel early death of his father, and that he bore it not out of hunger for it, but out of a deep and dutiful sense that it had been given to him by God, and could not therefore be set down. And then into the middle of all that grief, there came softly the other great fact of his life, and this one was made not of duty but of love. For Nicholas, that shy and inward young man, had already given his heart, wholly and completely, to a princess from a small German Grand Duchy, Princess Alex of Hesse. He had loved her for years, patiently, stubbornly, against a good deal of hesitation, and now, in the shadow of his father's coffin, with the court still in deep mourning, they were married, a wedding held quietly, without festival, the bride in white among the black of the mourners, so that later Alex would say that it felt as though they had been married at a funeral. She took a new name, and a new faith, and a new country, and she became the Empress Alexandra of Russia. And here, listener, is where you must watch the threads of this whole family draw tighter, for the marriage that Nicholas made for love did something more than make him happy. It wove him, and it wove the children they would have, more deeply than ever, into the single great royal family that sat over all of Europe, because Alex of Hesse was no stranger to that family. Her mother had been a daughter of Queen Victoria, the little grandmother of Europe, and so Alex herself was one of Victoria's own granddaughters, a girl who had spent tender parts of her childhood at Victoria's side, a favourite of the old Queen. Do you feel the knot pulling tight? For that same grandmother, Victoria, was grandmother also to the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, which meant that the new Russian Empress and the German Emperor were were themselves first cousins, playmates, and relations from the same enormous, quarrelsome, closely stitched clan. So consider what Nicholas had done, simply by marrying the woman he loved. He, the Tsar of Russia, had bound his own household to Britain, through his wife's grandmother, and to Germany, through his wife's cousin, and the little son and the daughters that he and Alexandra would one day cherish would carry in their veins the blood of the very houses that ruled the rival empires of the age. A family ruled the world, and by this marriage and a dozen marriages like it, the family only grew closer, cousin to cousin, throne to throne, until it seemed that the crowned heads of the continent were less a set of foreign powers than a single household spread across many houses. And what did Nicholas himself want? In the middle of all this grandeur, this blood, these empires touching hands across the map. This is the thing to hold on to, the thing that tells you who he really was among his cousins. He did not want power, he did not delight in it, did not reach for more of it, did not lie awake dreaming of the reach of his armies or the glory of his name. What Nicholas wanted, more than anything the world could offer him, was a quiet, private life with his wife and his children. To walk in a garden with Alexandra, to read aloud to her in the evenings, to play with the little ones on the floor, to chop wood in the fresh air, to go for long walks and note the weather in his diary, to be, in short, a happy husband and a devoted father in some sheltered corner far away from ministers and petitions and the endless, grinding machinery of state. He was happiest out of the public eye, uneasy in ceremony, shy before crowds, most himself when the doors were closed and the family was gathered, and the world, for a few hours, was kept outside. And there is something almost unbearably gentle in that, when you set it beside the throne he sat upon, for the throne of Russia asked above all things for a will of iron, for a ruler who could dominate and decide and impose himself upon 100 million people, and the man who now held it wished only to be left in peace among those he loved. Picture him then, beside his cousins, and picture especially his cousin George, far away in England, for the two of them, Nicholas and George, were so alike in face that strangers mistook one for the other. Two neat-bearded men, with the same eyes, the same quiet manner, the same soft courtesy, so nearly identical that at family weddings the guests would blink and look twice, unsure for a moment which cousin stood before them. And the likeness was not only in the face. Between Nicholas and George there ran a genuine and easy warmth, an affection of long standing, the fondness of two shy men who understood each other because they were made of the same quiet stuff. They wrote to each other as Nicky and Georgie, plainly, tenderly, cousin to cousin, without the stiffness of state, and each felt in the other a kind of brother, a man who, like himself, had come to a great throne without ever having craved it, and who would far rather have lived a small and private life than a large and public one. Of all the bonds in this scattered royal family, that one between the Tsar of Russia and the future King of England was among the warmest and the most human two look-alike cousins who loved each other simply and well. And so here is where we may let a gentle shadow fall across the picture. Not a jolt, only the faintest sense of floating, the kind you feel when a fire burns low and the room grows quiet, and you know, without quite thinking it, that the night is long. For set it all together now, softly, in the dark. Here is a man who is shy and kind and dutiful and deeply loving, a good man by nearly every account, a tender husband and a doting father. And here, resting upon that same gentle man, is an empire of 130 million people, an empire stretching across 2 continents, an empire held together by an autocracy so old and so absolute that it made no room for the sharing of its burdens, an empire already straining quietly beneath pressures that were gathering in its cities and its factories and its vast, patient countryside, pressures that Nicholas, for all his goodness, only half understood, and was, by his very nature, only half equipped to meet. He wanted a quiet life. He had been given the loudest throne on earth. He longed to be a private man. He had been made the most public figure in the world. He asked on the day his father died, what would happen now to Russia? And no one, in that grieving hour, could answer him. We will not tonight follow that question down all the long and sorrowful roads it would one day travel. For those roads belong to another telling, and this is a gentler hour. It is enough for now to have met him, Nicky, the third of our three cousins, the shy young Tsar who never wanted the crown, married for love to a granddaughter of Victoria, bound thereby ever more closely to the German Kaiser and the English king, carrying his enormous inheritance with a kind of patient bewilderment and loving, above all the empires of the earth, the small warm circle of his own family. A family ruled the world, and a family, we shall find, could not save it. But we are not yet at the saving or the failing. We are still in the quiet years, when three cousins reigned over three great empires, and might still, one might have hoped, have kept the peace between them. So let Nicholas rest there for a while, in his garden, with Alexandra beside him and the children at his feet, and let us turn, gently, back toward the others, and toward the slow and terrible way in which the ties of blood would prove no defence at all. Let us turn now, gently, to the quietest of the three, the one who never expected the weight that would one day settle upon him. Picture a boy who loved the sea, not the idea of the sea, not the paintings of it hung in gilded corridors, but the real thing, the salt of it and the cold of it, the creak of timber and the slap of water against a hull in the dark. Picture him young, a second son, standing on a deck with the wind in his face, and understand that here, and not upon any throne, was where he was happiest. His name was George, and for the greater part of his early life, no one, least of all George himself, imagined that he would ever be king. He had been born in the summer of 1865, the second son of the man who would become Edward VII, and of the beautiful, gentle Alexandra of Denmark. And in the arithmetic of monarchy, a second son is a spare, a reserve, a life kept in careful readiness against misfortune, but not, in the ordinary course of things, expected to reign. Ahead of George stood his elder brother, born a year before him, and it was that brother, and not George, who was the heir after their father. The one whose steps toward the crown were watched and worried over. So George was set free, in a sense, to become something else. And what he chose, or what was chosen for him, was the navy. Imagine the shape of that life. At the age of 12, still a child by any tender measure, George was sent to sea as a naval cadet, and for years afterward the ships were his schoolroom and his home. He crossed the great oceans. He stood watches through the long, empty hours of the night. He learned the discipline that the sea teaches without mercy and without exception. The discipline of routine, of duty done whether one feels like it or not, of small tasks performed exactly and on time, because upon such small exactness lives depend. This was the making of him. The navy took a shy, unremarkable boy and gave him a spine of iron habit, a plainness of speech, a love of order that would never leave him. He was not clever in the dazzling way that some princes are clever. He was something steadier than that. He was reliable, and in the deepest part of himself, George was never really a man of palaces. Picture instead what he loved when he was free to love anything. He loved his stamps, the great albums of them that he tended with the patient care of a collector, each small square of coloured paper, a little window onto the far corners of the world he had sailed. He loved his shooting, the cold, bright mornings out in the fields, the long walks, the plain companionship of countrymen. He was, at heart, a country gentleman who happened to be born a prince, a man who wanted a quiet house, a settled family, a life of predictable seasons, and who would have been content, entirely content, to live out his days that way, far from the noise of power. Remember this about him. Hold it softly as you drift, because it matters greatly to the whole of our story. Of the three cousins who would one day hold the fate of empires, this one never hungered for the throne at all. Ahead of him, as I have said, stood his elder brother. Prince Albert Victor was his full and formal name, but within the family, in the warm shorthand of people who love one another, he was simply Eddie. And Eddie was the true heir, the son whose path led straight toward the crown after their grandmother, and their father, the one upon whom the expectations pressed. He was a gentle soul in his way, languid and dreamy, often unwell, a young man who seemed to move through the world as if half asleep, and there were those close to the family who worried about him, quietly, in the way that families worry about the ones they cannot quite reach. His is a strange and sorrowful story of its own, and it is told tenderly elsewhere. For our purposes tonight, we need only hold him gently in the mind, this elder brother, and know that so long as he lived, George stood a comfortable step removed from destiny, free to be a sailor and a collector of stamps, and a man who loved the quiet. And then, in the winter of 1892, the quiet broke. It was a hard winter, and an influenza was moving through Britain that season, a great sweeping sickness that spared neither the poor in their cold rooms, nor the rich behind their high windows. It came for Eddie in the first days of the new year. He took to his bed with the fever, and for a handful of days the family gathered and hoped, and then hope thinned, and then it was gone. On a January morning, Prince Albert Victor died, at the age of just 28, with his life barely begun, and the crown he was born to still far off on the horizon he would never reach. Consider softly what that single loss did. In one stroke, in the space of a few fevered days, the whole order of things was rearranged. The elder son was gone, and the younger son, the sailor who had never wanted it, who had built for himself a life pointed entirely elsewhere, found himself lifted, without warning, into his brother's place. Georgie, who had gone to sea at 12, who kept his stamps and loved his shooting, was suddenly second in line to the throne of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The reserve had become the heir, the spare had become the successor. And there is something poignant in it, something that sits close to the heart, for he did not gain this place by any ambition of his own, but inherited it from a brother he had loved and lost, stepping into a life that had been meant for another, and the inheritance did not end with the throne. There is a detail here so tender, so quietly human, that it stays with you long after the facts around it have faded. At the time of his death, Eddie had been engaged to be married. His bride-to-be was a young princess named Mary of Teck, a serious and dutiful young woman, poised and intelligent, chosen with care as a fitting future queen. And when Eddie died, she was left as so much else was left, adrift in the wreckage of a future that would not now come to pass. In the months that followed, as the family drew together in its grief, a gentle understanding formed, unhurried and unforced, that George and Mary might find in one another what had been taken from them both. And so George, in time, married the young woman who had been promised to his brother. Picture how strange that must have felt at the first, and then how right it became. It began as an arrangement, a knitting together of two people bound by the same sorrow and the same duty, the sort of match that the world of royalty made all the time with cool calculation, but it did not stay cool. Between this plain, reticent sailor and this grave, careful princess, something real took root and grew, quietly, over the years, into one of the most devoted marriages that ever sat upon a throne. They were not demonstrative people, either of them. They did not pour out their feelings in grand gestures, but they came to lean upon one another entirely, to trust one another wholly, two reserved souls who found, in the shelter of each other, the one place where they could set the weight down. Mary of Teck, who might have been Eddie's queen, became George's wife, and his anchor, and the steady centre of his life, for all the long years that followed. So consider now the man that all of this had made, dutiful, above everything else, dutiful, a man who believed that one did what one was given to do and did it without complaint. Plain spoken, with none of the flowery courtliness of some princes, given rather to blunt and simple language, honest to the point of bluntness, conservative by every instinct, suspicious of novelty and change, at home with the old ways and the settled forms, disciplined endlessly by those years at sea, a man of routine so fixed that his days ran like a well-kept ship, everything in its hour and its place, reticent, private, uneasy with display, happiest away from crowds. He was not a brilliant man, and he never pretended to be one. He was a good one, in the ordinary unglamorous meaning of that word, and he was, above all, a man who understood duty as the very ground he stood upon. And when at last the crown came to him, in the year 1910, upon the death of his father, this was the kind of king that this shy sailor became, and here we arrive at the heart of the matter, at the difference that would mean everything. George became a constitutional king. He reigned, but he did not rule. He sat at the summit of the whole vast edifice of empire, and yet the true business of governing, the making of laws, the choosing of policies, the daily wielding of power, all of that lay in the hands of Parliament and of the ministers who answered to it. And George understood this and accepted it and worked within it. He would advise, he would encourage, he would gently warn, for these were the quiet privileges left to a monarch of his kind. But he would not command. He would not impose his own will upon the nation as though the country were his to steer. He had learned in the navy that a man serves the ship, and now he served in the same spirit, a king who saw himself as the servant of a settled order rather than its master. And here, as you rest, let the contrast rise softly in the mind, for it is the quiet centre of our whole tale. Set this George beside his cousin across the sea, Wilhelm, who wore his crown so differently. For Wilhelm believed it to the marrow, that a king's power came down to him from God alone, that he answered to heaven and to no parliament, that to rule was to grip the reins in his own two hands and drive the state himself by the force of his own will. And there were the others too, cousins and kin who held that same old faith in personal, God-given command, who could not imagine reigning without ruling, who saw the throne not as a trust to be held lightly, but as a possession to be wielded. Here were men of the same family, the same blood running in their veins, the same grandmother, the same childhood lawns, and yet how differently they held the thing that had been given them. For that is the strange truth at the centre of these three lives, and it is worth holding gently in the dark. A family ruled the world in those years, cousins upon the great thrones, bound by blood and by memory, and yet one of them, this plain sailor, this reluctant king who had never wanted the crown at all, would prove the one who endured, precisely because he did not grip too hard. He held his power loosely, as a trust and not a possession, content to be a figurehead above a self-governing people, and because he did not clutch at it, it did not break in his hands. The others, the autocrats, the believers in personal command, would grip and grip until the very gripping tore everything apart. The one who wanted the throne least kept it longest. The ones who held it most tightly would lose it altogether. But all of that still lies ahead of us, out beyond the edge of this quiet evening. For now let us leave George where he would have wished to be left, in the calm years before the storm, a dutiful man newly come to a crown he never sought, with his devoted wife beside him, and his stamps in their albums, and the settled rhythm of his days about him, like the familiar sea. He did not know what was coming. None of them did, and so we let him stand there a while longer, in the mild light, the sailor who became a king, before we turned softly to the cousins who ruled beside him, and to the gathering dark that none of them, for all their crowns, would prove able to hold back. Let us stay a little while longer in the world before the fall, in the last of its light, when the great houses of Europe still believed in their own permanence, and had every reason to. For there was a single afternoon one spring day in the city of London, when all of that world gathered itself into one long slow procession through the streets and let itself be seen, entire, gleaming and grave and utterly certain of tomorrow. If you want to understand how far these cousins would eventually fall, you must first understand how high they stood on that day, and how warm the air was around them, and how impossible it would have seemed to any of them that the ground beneath their polished boots was already beginning quietly to give way. It began, as so much in this story begins, with a death in the family. In the early days of May, in the year 1910, King Edward VII of the United Kingdom lay dying at Buckingham Palace. He was an old man now, heavy and short of breath, his lungs failing him after a lifetime of cigars and rich dinners, and the long patient waiting that had been his lot as the eldest son of a mother who would not die. For nearly 60 years he had been the Prince of Wales, kept from the throne, kept from real work, filling his days with racing and shooting and the company of beautiful women and the courts of Europe, until at last, only in his 60th year, his mother Queen Victoria had passed and left him a king. He had reigned less than a decade, and now, on the 6th of May, with the evening coming on, he slipped away, and the bells of London began to toll. Picture what that death meant, not only for one country, but for the whole tangled family that this old man had sat at the centre of. For Edward VII was not merely a king, he was, in a sense, the uncle of Europe, the genial, worldly, endlessly connected uncle, whose nieces and nephews and cousins sat upon half the thrones of the continent. He was the father of the man who would now be King George V. He was the uncle, the true blood uncle of the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, his sister's son. And he was uncle by marriage and cousin by the thousand threads of royal marriage to very nearly everyone else who wore a crown. When he died, the family felt it, in Berlin and in Athens and in Madrid and in Oslo, as families feel these things, as the loss of the man at the head of the table, the one whose Christmas letters and summer invitations had held the whole scattered clan loosely together. And so they came. That was the extraordinary thing. They came in person, the crowned heads of Europe, boarding their trains and their yachts, and crossing the Channel to stand in the cold marble of Westminster and mourn a man who had been, to so many of them, quite literally kin. The funeral was set for the 20th of May, a Friday, and in the 2 weeks between the death and the burial, London filled with kings. Imagine the scene on the morning of that funeral. Imagine the great crowds along the route, hundreds of thousands of people, dressed in black, standing hushed and pressed together on the pavements, in the windows, on the rooftops waiting. Imagine the slow drums, the muffled hooves, the gun carriage bearing the coffin, and upon the coffin the crown, and the orb, and the sceptre, and walking just behind, small and stiff, the dead king's little dog, a terrier named Caesar, who had loved his master and now followed him one last time. And then behind the coffin, on horseback, in a long shining river of uniforms and plumes and decorations, came the mourners. And these mourners were themselves the sovereigns of the earth, 9 of them. 9 reigning kings riding together at one time in one procession through the streets of a single city. It is worth saying that number again, slowly, because there has never been anything quite like it before or since. 9 men who each ruled a nation in his own right, gathered shoulder to bury a 10th. There rode the new master of the house, King George V of Britain, Edward's son, now a king himself at 3 days' notice, grave and dutiful, and quietly overwhelmed. There rode the King of Norway, and the King of Greece, and the King of Spain, and the King of Denmark, and the King of the Belgians, and the King of Bulgaria, and the King of Portugal. And there, riding near the very front, near his cousin George, in the pale blue and silver of a British field marshal's uniform, which his dead uncle had once given him the honour of wearing, rode Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Hold that image a moment, because it is the heart of the whole matter. Wilhelm and Edward had feuded for years, the prickly, brilliant, insecure nephew, and the smooth, worldly, disapproving uncle, forever misunderstanding one another, forever wounding one another across the dinner tables and the diplomatic dispatches of Europe. Wilhelm had chafed under the older man's easy charm. Edward had sighed over the younger man's boasts and rages. And yet, when the end came, it was Wilhelm who crossed the sea at once. Wilhelm who stood at the deathbed's edge in spirit, and at the graveside, in fact, Wilhelm who was seen to grieve, honestly and openly, for the uncle he had never quite been able to please. He came to bury a man he had quarrelled with and loved in almost equal measure, and he rode at his cousin's side to do it. The two of them together, at the head of that impossible procession, cousins and kings, mourning a father and an uncle in the same breath. Now, there is a name you might expect to find in that gathering, and you will not find it, and it matters that you do not. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, the third of our cousins, the gentle, doomed autocrat of the East, was not among those 9 kings. He did not ride through London that day. Russia sent others to represent her in the morning, as was proper, but the Tsar himself remained in his own vast country, and so of the 3 young men whose story this is, only 2 stood together in that spring procession. George and Wilhelm rode side by side beneath the London sky. Nicholas was elsewhere. Remember that, gently, because the family in this tale is never quite all in one place at one time, and the threads that bind them are longer and more fragile than they appear, but let us not hurry past the wonder of it. Let us stay in that golden hour, and let it open outward, because that single procession was only the visible peak of something far larger, a whole world of interlinked courts at the very summit of their glory. Picture it, in the years on either side of that funeral. Picture the constant, comfortable traffic between the palaces of Europe, the royal yachts steaming from harbour to harbour, the private trains with their crested carriages carrying one cousin to visit another. They were forever visiting. A king would take his family to the seaside and find another king's family already there. They would summer together on the same stretches of coast, at the same spas, in the same grand hotels and hunting lodges, the children playing on the same lawns, while the grown cousins talked of horses and regiments and the small gossip of thrones. They stood as godparents to one another's babies. They travelled across the continent for one another's weddings, and the weddings themselves were vast family reunions, the cathedrals packed with kings and queens and grand dukes who were all, in the end, some degree of cousin to the bride and groom. Picture, too, the photographs they loved to take, for they adored dressing in one another's uniforms. It was a courtesy among royal cousins, a warm and clubbable gesture, to be made an honorary colonel of a foreign regiment. And so Wilhelm would be photographed in the scarlet of a British admiral, and George in the spiked helmet of a Prussian, and they would stand together, moustached and medalled and pleased with themselves, cousins playing at soldiers in each other's colours, none of them dreaming that the uniforms would one day mean something terrible. To them in that hour, the uniforms were only love, the visible sign that they belonged to one another, that the armies of Europe were, at the top, all in the family. And this is the thing you must feel, lying there in the dark, if you're to feel the whole weight of what came after. There was, in that world, a warm and comfortable and utterly mistaken conviction, shared by nearly all of them, that a Europe ruled by one great family could never truly fall into a general war. How could it? They knew one another. They had played together as children, holidayed together as men, married one another's sisters and daughters. When a crisis flared, a king could simply write to his cousin, one to another, in the old familiar way. And surely, blood and affection and the long habit of kinship would smooth it over, as such things had always been smoothed over. War between the great powers would be war between cousins, between brothers-in-law, between godfathers and godsons. And that, they told themselves, was simply unthinkable. The family was the safeguard. The family was the peace. A Europe of relatives could quarrel, could sulk, could bristle and posture, but it could not at the last take up arms against itself. Here a family ruled the world, and here a family believed with all its heart that it could keep the world from harm. And on that May afternoon in 1910, riding through the black-clad crowds of London, they had every reason to believe it. Look at them in your mind's eye, though of course you cannot look. So let me simply hold the picture up for you in words. See the 9 kings on their horses, the sunlight catching the gold of their braid and the steel of their helmets, the whole gorgeous, gleaming apparatus of monarchy moving as one slow body through the greatest city in the world, watched by millions, mourning one of their own, with all the pomp that centuries had taught them. It was the high-water mark of royal Europe. It was the golden hour, the last of the long afternoon, before the evening came. Never before had so many crowns gathered in one place, and never again would they. Something was ending in that very procession, though not one soul among them knew it. The funeral of King Edward was, though no one could have said so, very nearly the funeral of their whole shining world. For here is the quiet, terrible thing, and I will set it down softly, because it is the kind of thing best said in a low voice. Within 4 years, 4 short years, of that golden gathering, these same men, these same smiling, uniformed, comfortable cousins would be sitting at their desks in Berlin and London and their palaces beyond, and they would be signing the orders, the mobilization orders, the declarations, the papers that would send their nations marching against one another, that would empty the very regiments whose colourful uniforms they had so fondly worn for the camera, that would fill the fields of Europe with the dead of a war so vast the world had no name, yet terrible enough for it. The cousins who rode together behind their uncle's coffin would, before the decade turned, be the authors of one another's ruin, and of the ruin of the whole family, and of the old world that had made them. But not yet, not on that day. That is the mercy and the sorrow of it, both at once. That on that bright, grave morning in May, riding through the hush of London, with the drums beating slow, not one of them could see it coming. Wilhelm could not see it, grieving there beside his cousin. George could not see it, 3 days a king, and steadying himself for the long reign ahead. None of the 9 could see it. The future was closed to them, as it is closed to all of us. And so they rode on through the golden light, in perfect, innocent ignorance of the dark, believing, as families do, that the ones they loved would always be there, and that the world they knew would last. Let us leave them there a moment in that light before it fades, the family at the summit of the world, mourning one of their own, and quite certain, quite gently and warmly certain, that they would never have cause to mourn like this again. They were wrong, of course, but we need not tell them so, not tonight. Let them ride on. And so, before the spark ever fell, before the single shot that history would remember, there was already something waiting beneath these 3 men, something vast and patient, and quietly turning, and it is to that hidden thing we come now, gently, in the dark. Let the faces of the cousins soften for a while in your mind. Set aside, for a moment, the crowns, the medals, the long dinners and the letters signed with childhood names, and imagine instead the ground on which they stood, the deep machinery of the age they had inherited. For the truth, the slow and sobering truth, is that the great war that was coming did not rise from any one heart. It rose from a structure, an arrangement of things that had been built up over many years by many hands, and that no single hand, however royal, could now easily take apart. Picture Europe, then, as it lay in those last quiet years, and picture it not as a map of colours, but as a web. Over decades, the great powers had drawn themselves together into 2 great groupings, 2 camps, each bound by promises, by treaties, by understandings written and unwritten. On the one side there had gathered what men called the Triple Entente, the drawing together of Britain and France and Russia, 3 powers who had once been rivals, and now, warily, leaned toward one another. And on the other side stood the Triple Alliance, built around Germany and Austria-Hungary, the two central empires whose lands lay pressed together in the heart of the continent, joined by language, by history, and by a shared unease about the powers that ringed them round. Now there is nothing strange in itself about nations seeking friends. It is an old and human thing to want an ally at your back. But consider, softly, what these alliances had quietly become. Each promise carried within it a small and heavy clause, a pledge that if one partner were attacked, the others would come to its aid. And so the powers of Europe had bound themselves to one another the way climbers bind themselves upon a mountain, roped together across the ice, each man tied to the next for safety, so that no single climber should fall alone into the white. It is a comfort, that rope, when the footing holds. It is a very different thing when one man slips, for then the rope that was meant to save him becomes the very thing that drags the others after him, one pulled by the next, the whole line sliding toward the edge before any of them has time to dig in his heels. That was the shape of it. A quarrel between any two powers, however far away, however small its origin, could now tug upon the ropes that ran the length of the continent, and pull the rest, unwilling, over the lip of the same abyss. A dispute in the east could summon armies in the west. A grievance in one corner could call up empires in another. The alliances that had been made to keep the peace, to balance strength against strength, so that no one would dare to move, had woven Europe into a single trembling web, in which a tremor at any point was felt, at once, everywhere. And beneath that web, feeding it, hardening it, ran another current, and this one you could hear if you listened, in the shipyards and the barracks and the foundries of the age. For these were the years of the great arms race, the years when the powers had set themselves, quietly, and then not so quietly, to the building of engines of war on a scale the world had never seen. Picture the coasts of Britain and of Germany, and picture rising there, out of the smoke and the hammering, the great grey battleships, the dreadnoughts, each one larger and more heavily gunned than the last, floating fortresses of steel that cost fortunes to build, and that were obsolete almost before their paint had dried, because across the water the rival yard had already laid down something greater. Each new ship in one harbour called forth a new ship in the other, and so the tally climbed, hull by hull, gun by gun, a contest with no visible finish line, in which to stop building felt like surrender, and to keep building felt like safety. Imagine the crowds that gathered at the launchings, the flags, the cheering, the pride of a nation poured into a single hull as it slid down the slipway into the sea, and imagine, too, the men who counted these ships from across the water, tallying them soberly in their ledgers, and feeling, with each new name added to the enemy's list, the cold need to answer it with one of their own. It was a ladder, and neither side could climb down from it without the other climbing down first, and so neither side climbed down at all. And it was not only ships. On land, the armies swelled year upon year, drawing in the young men of the continent through conscription, that quiet summons that reached into every village and took the sons away for their training, and gave them back as soldiers held in reserve, millions upon millions of them, listed in ledgers, sorted by age and by region, ready to be called. Whole nations had become, in a sense, armies that happened also to farm, and to trade, and to raise children. And over all of this there settled a mood, a strange and heavy weather of the spirit, a growing feeling across Europe, that war was no longer merely possible, but was somehow coming, sooner or later, whether anyone wished it or not, and that in such a world the safest thing, the only sensible thing, was to be ready first, to be ready first. That was the thought that lay in so many minds, in the general staffs and the newspapers and the clubs, the belief that the danger lay not in preparing for war, but in being caught unprepared, and that whoever struck soonest, once the striking began, would be the one to survive. It was a mood that made peace feel fragile, and war feel almost like a relief, a thing long dreaded and therefore, in some corner of the heart, almost longed for, if only to have the waiting done. Now let your mind travel, gently, to the southeast of the continent, down to the mountains and valleys of the Balkans, for it was there that the danger gathered most thickly, and there that men, when they spoke of what frightened them, most often pointed. Picture a patchwork land, a place where peoples lay against one another like the pieces of a quilt sewn by no single hand. Serbs and Croats, Greeks and Bulgarians, Romanians and Albanians and Turks, many faiths, many tongues, many long memories of old wounds not yet healed. And picture, meeting there, decaying, the old empires, the Ottoman power that had ruled these lands for centuries and was now slowly loosening its grip, and the Empire of Austria-Hungary pressing down from the north, and behind them the great shadow of Russia, who felt herself the protector of the Slavic peoples and watched the region with a mother's jealous eye. Into that small and crowded space, the ambitions of the great powers and the fierce young nationalisms of the small peoples were pressed together, grievance upon grievance, hope against hope. Men called it the powder keg of Europe, and the name has lasted, because it was true, a place packed tight with the dry powder of resentment and longing, needing only a single spark to loose all its stored and terrible force. But we are not yet at the spark. Hold that image only, the powder waiting in the dark, and let us go deeper still, to the last thing, the deepest thing, the thing that matters most for the three cousins, asleep as it were, at the top of it all. For beneath the alliances and beneath the fleets and the armies and beneath the smouldering Balkans, there lay something quieter and in its way more frightening than any of them, because it moved by clockwork and not by choice. In the war ministries of every great power, in the still rooms where the general staffs did their patient work, there had been drawn up, over long years, the mobilization plans. Try to picture what these were. Imagine great volumes, thick as altar books, filled not with prayers but with timetables, page after page of them, listing where each regiment would gather, and on which day, which trains would carry them, and at what hour, which bridges they would cross and which roads they would march, down to the loaves of bread and the bales of hay. All of it fixed in advance, all of it counted, all of it timed to the minute. Millions of men were to be summoned from their farms and their workshops, and set moving across the land in one vast choreographed flood. And the whole of it depended upon the railways, upon trains running to a schedule of iron, each following the next so closely that a single delay might tangle the movement of 100 others. And here is the heart of it, the thing to hold as you drift. These plans were built for speed, and speed made them rigid, terribly, unalterably rigid. Because everyone believed that the first to be ready would prevail, each plan was designed to unfold as fast as machinery could carry it, and a machine built for such speed cannot easily be slowed or turned or halted once it has begun. To start the great mobilization was to set in motion the trains, the timetables, the millions, all at once and all together, and to stop them halfway, the generals warned, would be to invite ruin, to leave your armies half-formed and helpless, while the enemy came on complete. And so the plans had a dreadful logic of their own. Once begun, they wished to be finished. Once the first train rolled, it called for the next, and the whole vast sequence strained to run its course to the end, whatever the men at the top might come to wish. Consider, then, what this meant for our three cousins, for the king and the Kaiser and the Tsar, who wore the uniforms and held, in name, the supreme command of these forces. It meant that a machine had been built beneath them of such size, such momentum, such intricate and interlocking parts, that they could no longer truly steer it, though they still sat, gleaming, at its head. The generals had made it. The staff officers had made it, year upon careful year, in rooms the emperors seldom entered, and they had made it so vast and so swift that the man who supposedly commanded it was becoming, slowly and almost without noticing, something less than its master. He could bless it. He could sign the order that woke it, but he could not, once it was moving, easily bid it stop, for the moving of it had passed out of the world of a man's will and into the world of railway schedules and mobilization tables which answer to no crown. Think of a great river, swollen and dark, held for now behind a wall of earth. A man may stand upon the wall and feel himself the lord of all that water, and so long as the wall holds, he is. But let the wall once give at a single point, and the water will go where its own weight carries it, and no lord upon the bank can call it back, or turn it, or tell it to run slower. The plans were like that held river, and the emperors were the men upon the wall, and they did not yet know how thin, in places, the wall had grown. And so we come to the quiet and sorrowful truth at the centre of this whole long night. A family ruled the world, in those years, 3 cousins upon 3 great thrones, wearing between them the crowns of the mightiest empires the earth had seen. And yet a family could not save it, could not save the world, nor even themselves, because the thing that was coming did not belong to families or to men. They looked, these 3, like the most powerful figures alive, and in the eyes of their peoples they were, robed and crowned and saluted, their words trembling in the mouths of ministers, their portraits hung in 100 million homes. But beneath the robes and behind the salutes, something had shifted that no one had quite meant to allow. The alliances they had inherited, the fleets and the armies their pride had raised, the timetables their generals had perfected, had grown into a single great engine, and the men who sat atop it were becoming, very quietly, not its drivers, but its passengers, borne along by a momentum they had helped to build and could no longer command. They did not know this yet, not fully, not in their bones. They still wrote their letters and traded their friendly names and told themselves, as cousins will, that surely 3 men who had played together as boys would never let matters come to the worst. And perhaps, on some soft evening, one of them believed it. But the machine beneath the thrones did not read their letters, and it did not remember the lawns of their grandmothers' houses, and it was already, in those last calm years, turning over, warm and waiting, needing only one small thing from the world outside to begin. And out in the southeast, in the crowded valleys of that patchwork land, the summer was coming on. And so we come to a morning in summer, a morning that begins like any other, warm and ordinary, in a city that most of the crowned heads of Europe could not have found quickly on a map, the 28th of June in the year 1914. Picture the city of Sarajevo in the province of Bosnia on that Sunday morning. The light already bright and heavy with heat, the streets swept and hung with flags, the river Miljacka moving slow and green along its stone embankment. It was a feast day, and also, by a quiet cruelty of the calendar, an anniversary that some in that crowd remembered with bitterness, a date that meant defeat and grief to the Serbs who lived there. But the town wore its holiday face, and the balconies were crowded, and children had been let out to wave, and along the riverside road the people gathered to see the great man come. The great man was the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the ancient throne of Austria-Hungary, nephew to the old and weary Emperor Franz Joseph, the man who would one day, and soon it seemed, inherit that vast and creaking empire of a dozen quarrelling peoples. He had come to inspect the army in its summer manoeuvres and to show himself to a restless province, and beside him rode his wife, Sophie, whom he loved with a devotion that had cost him dearly at court, for she was not thought grand enough for him, and their marriage had been permitted only on hard and humiliating terms. Yet here, away from Vienna, on a tour of a distant frontier, the old rules loosened a little, and she could ride at his side in the open car, the two of them together in the sunlight, and perhaps that was some small happiness to them on that last morning. Picture them then, a middle-aged husband and wife in their finery, a man with his plumed hat and his tunic buttoned tight against the heat, a woman in a white dress with a wide summer hat, riding in an open motor car through a cheering town, with no notion, none at all, that the day had already been marked. For in that same crowd, scattered along the route, stood a handful of very young men, boys almost, their pockets weighted with bombs and pistols, their heads full of a fierce and unripe dream of a South Slav nation freed from Austrian rule. They had crossed the border with their weapons, they had waited, and now they stood among the flags and the families and waited still. And here, gently, is the first turning of the morning. As the line of cars moved along the embankment, one of these young men flung a bomb toward the Archduke's motor car. It struck the folded roof, or glanced from it, and rolled away and burst behind, in the road, wounding officers and bystanders in the following car, sending up smoke and screams and the sudden ruin of the holiday. The Archduke's driver sped on. Franz Ferdinand arrived at the town hall, shaken and angry, his careful day already broken, and there, on the steps, the mayor began, absurdly, to read out his prepared speech of welcome, of loyal and joyful greeting, while the Archduke stood trembling with the noise of the blast still in his ears. It should have ended there. By every measure of sense, the visit should have ended and the couple should have been taken away, out of that town, out of the reach of whatever else was waiting. And in a way, that is the hardest part of the story to bear, that the danger was known, that the morning had already shown its hand and still the machinery of the day rolled on. For the Archduke, brave and stubborn and stung, resolved to go on. He would visit the wounded in the hospital. He would not be driven from the streets by cowards. And so once more they climbed into the open car, husband and wife, and once more they set out along the river. But no one had told the drivers clearly of the change of plan, and so the lead car turned, as first arranged, off the embankment and into a narrow side street, and the Archduke's car followed, turning after it into the wrong road. Someone in the party called out that this was a mistake, that they must go straight on, along the river, and the driver, confused, braked and stopped, and began, slowly, to reverse. And here is the terrible chance of it, the hinge on which so much would turn, for the car came to rest, stalled and reversing, at the corner of that street, no more than a few feet from where a young man happened to be standing, one of the same band, a slight, consumptive Bosnian Serb of 19 years named Gavrilo Princip, who had thought the day already lost, and had drifted there almost by accident. He could not have missed. He was so close that he did not even raise the pistol far. 2 shots spaced only by a heartbeat, quiet almost against the noise of the street. One struck the Archduke in the neck, one struck Sophie in the side. For a moment, it is said, no one understood that anything had happened, for the two of them sat upright still, side by side, as though the day went on. Then a thread of blood came to the Archduke's lips, and Sophie sank against him, and he begged her, in the last clear words anyone heard from him, to live, to stay alive for their children. Picture it slowly, without any shock, without any cry, for that is how it truly was. 2 people in the sunlight, upright a moment longer than seemed possible, and then gone. They were carried to the governor's residence, and within the hour both were dead. A husband and a wife, on a summer Sunday, in a foreign street, killed by a boy who would himself be dead of illness in a prison cell. Before the war he had helped to start was even ended. That is all it was at first. 2 people dead, a boy in handcuffs, a town in shock, a black telegram sent to Vienna. And here we must speak plainly and gently of the strangeness of what followed. For the killing of an archduke, however terrible, was not in itself the death of a continent. Emperors had been shot before, kings had fallen to assassins, and the world had gone on. What made this different was not the 2 shots in Sarajevo, but the machinery. Those shots woke, slowly, over the weeks that came after, a machinery of alliances and fears and old resentments, tightened and oiled through the long peace, waiting. A fuse had been lit in a summer street, and no one, in that first hour, understood how long the fuse was, nor what lay at the end of it. Through the hot weeks of July, then, the thing unfolded, not with any noise, but with the slow gravity of a stone beginning to roll. In Vienna, the old men of the court, grieving little for the difficult archduke they had lost, but seeing in his death a chance long wished for, resolved that Serbia, whom they blamed for harbouring the plotters, must be punished, humbled, brought to heel once and for all. But Austria-Hungary would not move without her great ally, and so a message went north to Berlin, to the Kaiser, to Wilhelm, asking whether Germany would stand behind her if she acted. And Germany, in what would come to be called the blank check, answered yes, act and act quickly, and we are with you. Picture that promise given almost carelessly, in the confidence of a summer, the Kaiser himself soon departing on his yearly cruise among the northern fjords, trusting that a short, sharp quarrel in the Balkans would burn itself out, as such quarrels always had. And so, emboldened, Austria-Hungary drew up an ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands so heavy, so deliberately humiliating, that it was designed in truth not to be accepted, for what was wanted was not agreement, but a pretext. It demanded that Austrian officials be allowed onto Serbian soil to hunt the conspirators, a thing no proud small nation could grant and keep its honour. Serbia was given 48 hours, and Serbia, frightened, answered with astonishing meekness, conceding nearly everything, all but the one point that would have surrendered her sovereignty entirely. And it was very nearly enough, so nearly enough that even the Kaiser, reading the reply, would scrawl that now every reason for war had fallen away. But by then the wheels had their own momentum. Austria declared the answer insufficient and broke off relations and turned toward the mobilizing of her armies. And now gently, the ropes that bound the powers together began to draw taut, each pulling on the next. For Serbia, small and threatened, looked to Russia, her great Slavic protector, and in St. Petersburg, the Tsar Nicholas felt the weight of an obligation he could not easily set down. For Russia had backed away from the Balkans before and been shamed for it, and could not be seen to abandon a little brother nation again. And Russia's stirring would rouse Germany, who stood behind Austria, and Germany's fear was of France, Russia's ally in the West. And beyond France lay Britain, bound by old understandings and by the narrow sea. Picture it, then, as a great web strung across the whole of the continent, every strand tied to every other, so that a tug at one far corner, in a Bosnian street, ran trembling along every thread, and the spiders at the centre, the men who might have cut a strand and let the tension go, sat still, each watching the others, each unwilling to be the first to seem afraid. And here, at last, we come to the part of the story that belongs most truly to us, the human note beneath the marching of events. For understand, in those first fatal weeks, the crowned cousins of Europe still did not quite believe it. A family ruled the world. In that summer, 3 men who shared a grandmother's blood, who had worn each other's uniforms and stood as godfathers to each other's children, who signed their letters with the small warm names of the nursery. And a family surely could not truly go to war with itself. So they told themselves, half believing, as the days grew hotter. The Kaiser went cruising in the north among the cold, clean waters, reading his telegrams, a day late, sure that the storm would pass. The Tsar remained at his palace by the sea, with his wife and his children, walking in the gardens, playing with his little son, writing that surely, Cousin Willy would not let it come to this. In London, the king followed the reports with a growing unease he could not yet name. The great courts went on for a while, with their summer plans, the cruises and the shooting parties and the taking of the waters, each of these men half trusting that reason, or blood, or plain common sense, would reach out at the last moment and hold the whole thing back from the edge. A family ruled the world, and each of them believed, in those quiet July days, that a family could not fail to save it. That was the tragedy folded inside the tragedy, that they were not wicked men, nor even, most of them, especially foolish, but men who trusted too long in the ties that bound them, who could not imagine that the machinery they sat atop might carry them somewhere none of them wished to go. For beneath the cruises and the garden walks and the reassuring letters, the machinery had begun, very quietly, to turn. In the war ministries and the general staffs, in rooms the cousins scarcely thought about, the great plans were being lifted from their shelves, the timetables of mobilization, the railway schedules worked out to the hour, the orders that, once given, could not easily be called back. Armies of millions did not gather in a day. They gathered by plan, by rail, by the ringing of telegraph and the calling up of reservists from 1,000 villages. And every general knew that to begin late was to lose, and so each pressed his monarch to let him begin. And so, as July burned toward its end, the two things moved side by side, the one above and the one below. Above, the cousins wrote and hoped and half slept through the warm nights, still telling themselves that it would not come, that some word between them, some old affection, would yet be enough. And below in the quiet, the wheels turned faster, the ropes drew tighter, and one by one the men in the palaces began to lift their heads from their summer ease and to feel, at last, the cold breath of the thing they had not believed in. They began to grasp in those final hours before the mobilizations that the danger was real, that it was near, that it might already be beyond the reach of any letter. And each of them, alone in his own great house, turned his mind at last toward the others, toward the cousins across the borders, and wondered whether there was still time, whether a word sent now, tonight, might yet hold it all back from the brink. Come back now to the very end of that July, the July of 1914, when the days were long and warm across Europe, and the hay stood cut in the fields, and the great cities lay drowsy under a summer haze. And beneath all that ordinary sweetness, a fuse was burning. You will remember the shot that lit it, a month before, in a narrow street in a distant city, an archduke and his wife slumped in an open motor car, and the small ripple of that killing spreading outward, wider and wider, until it lapped against every throne on the continent. By the last week of July, the ripple had become a tide. Austria, grieving and furious, had turned upon little Serbia, and had sent her an ultimatum so severe that no proud nation could accept the whole of it, and then, dissatisfied, had begun to move her guns. And Russia, vast and slow and devout, who thought of the Serbs as younger brothers of the same blood and the same faith, could not simply stand by and watch them crushed. And Germany, bound by iron promises to Austria, stood squarely behind her ally, her hand upon her sword. Picture the map of Europe in those hours as a single taut web, every strand connected to every other, so that a tremor in one far corner ran shivering through them all. And now imagine the men whose duty it was to hold that web steady, and how few of them truly could. For here is the strange and terrible heart of it. The men who sat at the very top of those tottering empires were not strangers to one another. They were not distant rivals who had never met. They were family. Two of them in particular, the German Emperor Wilhelm II and the Emperor of all the Russias, Nicholas II, were cousins, connected through the tangled royal bloodlines of Europe. Cousins who had known each other since they were young men, who had visited one another's palaces, who had sailed together on summer yachts, who had stood side by side reviewing troops, each dressed, as was the courtesy between them, in the uniform of the other's army. To Wilhelm, the tall and restless German, the quiet Russian, was simply Nicky. To Nicholas, the shy and gentle Tsar, the loud and glittering German, was simply Willy. And in those last unbearable days of July, as the armies of the continent stirred in their barracks, and the diplomats sent their careful, deadly notes, these two men did something almost unbearably intimate. They picked up, in effect, the telephone of their age. They began, cousin to cousin in the dark, to send each other telegrams. They wrote them in English, that easy schoolroom English of their childhood, the language of their shared grandmothers' drawing rooms, and they signed them not with titles, not with the weight of empire, but with the pet names of boyhood. Willy, Nicky, imagine that. Two of the most powerful men who had ever lived, men who between them commanded millions of soldiers and the fate of half the earth, sitting up through the small hours in their separate palaces, each with a pencil and a telegraph form, each writing to the other by the name a nurse had once used, each pleading, and there is no gentler word for it, pleading with the other to hold back, to wait, to not let this happen. Listen to how it began. On the night of the 29th of July, the Tsar sent word across the wires to Berlin. An ignoble war, he called what was coming, has been declared on a weak country, and the indignation in Russia is enormous. He begged his cousin, in the name of their old friendship, to do what he could to stop his ally from going too far, and almost in the same hour, a telegram from Wilhelm was travelling the other way, crossing the Russians in the darkness between the two capitals, for they wrote at the same time, you understand, each unaware of what the other was that moment setting down. Wilhelm's message was warm too and anxious. He was exerting his utmost influence, he said, to bring Austria to a frank and satisfactory understanding. He was sure that Nicky would help him in his task. He signed it, as he always did, your very sincere and devoted friend and cousin, Willy. And for a moment, only a moment, you can almost believe it might have worked. Two men who loved each other, or who at least remembered loving each other, leaning across the abyss, each holding out a hand. Nicholas, in one of those cables, reached for the noblest idea he knew. Let the whole Austro-Serbian problem, he wrote, be given over to the great international court at The Hague. Let cool and disinterested judges weigh it, rather than armies. It was a good and decent thought, the thought of a man who did not want blood, and it hangs there in the record now, like a small candle held up against a rising wind. But Wilhelm did not take it. In his replies, warmth began to harden into something colder and more frightened. Russia was mobilizing, he said. Russia was gathering her soldiers along his frontier, and every hour she did so, the danger to Germany grew. It is not I, he seemed to say. It is you. You must stop. You must halt your armies, or I cannot answer for what follows. Then the whole weight of the decision, he told his cousin, would rest on your shoulders. And so the tone of the telegram shifted, night by night, from one anxious friend calming another into two frightened men, each insisting he wanted only peace, and each telling the other that the other was the one making peace impossible. Read them over now, those cables as they lie side by side in the record, and you will find something that catches in the throat. There is no villainy in them, not really, no cackling, no lust for conquest, none of the things we imagine when we think of the men who begin great wars. There is only fear and tenderness and a kind of mounting helplessness, dressed in the stiff courtesy of emperors. In gratitude for your telegram, Nicholas wrote in one of them, moderate and conciliatory, while at the same time the official message conveyed today by your ambassador has been in a very different tone. And you can feel him there, the gentle Tsar, trying to reconcile the loving cousin who wrote to him at midnight with the vast and grinding apparatus of state that spoke to him by day, and failing to make the two agree because they could not be made to agree. Wilhelm, for his part, kept returning to the same anguished note over and over, like a man pressing on a wound. My friendship for you and your empire, he told Nicky, transmitted to me by my grandfather on his deathbed, has always been sacred to me. He meant it. That is the pity of it. He meant every word, and it changed nothing, because by the time each telegram was decoded and carried up the palace stairs and laid upon the desk, the hour it spoke of had already passed, and the armies had already moved a little further, and the two cousins were forever answering questions that the world had already answered for them. That is the surface of it. But underneath the surface, something far larger and far crueler was already in motion, and it is here that the true sorrow of this story lives. For while Willy and Nicky wrote their tender, desperate cables, the machinery of war had begun to turn beneath them, and that machinery did not read telegrams, and it did not answer to pet names, and it had a momentum that no cousin's affection could arrest. You must understand what mobilization meant in that age, because it is the hinge on which everything broke. To mobilize was not merely to say a stern word or to make a threat. It was to set in motion a vast, intricate clockwork plan, drawn up years in advance by pale and careful men in war ministries, a plan that summoned millions of ordinary sons and husbands from their farms and their workshops, that armed them and fed them and packed them into trains. And those trains ran on timetables scheduled to the very hour, each locomotive slotted behind the next along the single-track lines, so that once the first whistle blew, the whole immense apparatus began to roll, and to stop it, or even to change it, was like trying to halt a river with your hands. The generals had built these plans as their life's work. They believed, to the marrow of their bones, that whoever mobilized first and fastest would win, and whoever hesitated would be overrun. And so every delay felt to them like a knife held to the nation's throat. And now picture the Tsar of all the Russias, gentle Nicky, caught between that machinery and his own aching heart. On the very night the telegrams were flying, he tried to do a merciful thing. He tried to order not a full mobilization, not the arming of his whole vast empire against Germany, but only a partial one, soldiers gathered against Austria alone, in the south, as a warning, a gesture, something short of the abyss. He signed the order. He believed, being emperor, that his word was law. And then his own generals came to him, grave and insistent, and told him a thing that must have felt like the floor giving way beneath the throne. It could not be done. The plans did not allow for it. There was no timetable for a partial mobilization. The trains, the schedules, the mustering of the reserves had all been built around one single plan, the plan for the whole, and to attempt the half would tangle the whole into ruin. Choose all, they told him, or choose nothing. And so the Tsar, who wished only for a small and careful measure, was informed by the men who served him that the small and careful measure did not exist, that the machine he supposedly commanded would move only at full flood, or not at all. Sit with that for a moment. There in the dark, here was a man who was called an autocrat, whose portrait hung in 1,000,000 homes, who was told from childhood that he ruled by the will of God, and in the 1 hour when it mattered above all others, he learned that he could not turn the wheel a single degree. He could sign his name. The machine would ignore what the name asked and do only what the machine had been built to do. On the 30th of July, worn down, weeping, they say, he gave the order for the general mobilization, the full one, the whole empire, because his generals had left him, as they saw it, no other road. And once Russia's millions began to move, Germany's own timetable, its own great and rigid plan, demanded that Germany move too at once, without pause, or lose the race forever. And so you see what had happened to Willy and Nicky, these two cousins in their palaces with their pencils and their pet names. They had believed, as their whole family had believed, all the kings and queens and emperors who were sons and daughters and grandchildren of the same few marriages. They had believed that a family that ruled the world could surely keep the world from war. They thought that blood and letters and childhood summers were a kind of anchor, that men who had worn each other's uniforms could never send their peoples to kill each other. It was a beautiful faith, and it was wrong. For in those last nights they discovered a thing more frightening than any enemy. They discovered that they were not the drivers of the great engine of their age. They were its passengers. A family had ruled the world, and now that same family found it could not save it. The telegrams went on crossing in the night, each overtaken by events before it could be answered, each a little further behind the terrible speed of the trains, until the words the cousins sent were like letters written to a house that was already burning. And then the words simply stopped mattering at all. On the 1st of August, in the year 1914, on a warm summer evening, the German Empire declared war upon the Russian Empire. Willy declared war on Nicky, the uniforms they had worn for each other, the yachts they had sailed, the grandmother whose lawns they had run across as boys. All of it was folded away now, put out of reach, buried beneath the thing that was beginning. The last cables between them went unanswered, trailing off into silence, and that silence would not be broken. These two men who had signed their letters with the names of children would never again speak to each other as friends. Somewhere in the German night, a telegraph key fell still. Somewhere in a Russian palace, a man in a plain soldier's tunic sat with the unanswered forms before him, and understood, perhaps for the first time fully, what had been done, and by whom, and how little any of them had truly been able to stop it. Picture the quiet in those two rooms, hundreds of miles apart. No shouting, no blow, only the small mechanical hush of instruments gone dead, and two cousins on either side of a frontier that was about to become a wound running the length of a continent. Everything they had feared and everything they had told each other could never happen because they were family. It was happening now, and it would go on happening, gathering the sons of every village into it, for years none of them could yet imagine. The bonds of the family had been real. The love in its strange, stiff royal way had been real. And all of it, every warm word signed Willy and Nicky, had proved lighter than a single railway timetable, powerless against the vast and patient machine that the whole family, over long complacent years, had helped to build. And so, on the 1st of August, the cousins fell silent, and beyond that silence, into the countries they ruled, and the millions who would answer for their quarrel. The long night was only beginning to come down. And so we come to the strangest and the saddest turning of the whole long story. The moment when everything that had bound these three men together, the shared blood, the shared childhoods, the letters signed Georgie and Willy and Nicky, was set against the machinery of nations at war, and could not stop it, and in the end was swept aside by it. Let yourself settle now, and breathe slowly, and imagine the world as it stood in that first strange summer, when the guns had opened and the telegrams had gone out, and there was no longer any way to call the thing back. Imagine the three of them, each in his own palace, each in his own uniform, the braid and the epaulets and the medals of an office none of them had chosen, taking up the pen and setting his name to the orders and the proclamations that would send his people out to kill the people of his cousins, by the 100, by the 1,000, by the million. It is one of those facts that the mind refuses at first to hold, and yet it is simply, quietly true. The men at the head of the warring empires had holidayed together. They had stood as godfathers to one another's children. They had ridden and shot and dined together on the summer lawns of a shared grandmother, and had called one another by the small soft names of boyhood. And now, in the offices of state, with all the gravity of their thrones, they were signing the papers that turned Europe into a charnel house. Picture it not as history, which is too large and too cold, but as it truly was, which was small and near and human. Picture a lane in an English village, and a woman at her gate in the grey of a morning, watching the telegraph boy come up the road, and praying, as every woman on that lane prayed, that he would pass her by. Picture the same morning in a wooden village on the Russian plain, and a mother crossing herself before an icon, and a chair at the table that will not be filled again. Picture a farmhouse in Germany, the harvest half in, and a father reading a folded paper by the window and saying nothing, and not being able to say anything for the rest of that day. Multiply that gate, that icon, that window, by the length and breadth of a continent, and let it run on. Not for a week, not for a season, but for 4 years, 4 winters, 4 springs that came whether the grief wanted them or not. That was the war, not the maps with their arrows, not the names of the battles that school children would one day be made to learn, but the endless columns of names in the newspapers, the lists that grew longer than any paper had been made to hold, the mud that swallowed men and horses and guns, and gave almost nothing back, the grief that reached into every parish and every street and every family until there was scarcely a household in Europe that did not keep an empty place. And above it all, presiding over it, the figureheads, the 3 cousins, the men who as boys had played together, and who now, in their separate capitals, could each look at the map of the slaughter, and know that somewhere across the lines, in a palace much like his own, sat a face he had known since childhood, ordering the same thing back. There is a horror in that which no battlefield holds, and it is a quiet horror, the kind you feel in the chest, rather than the eyes. For war between strangers is terrible. But war between a family is something stranger still, and these three had been, in the truest sense, a family. A family ruled the world in those years, 3 empires and a scattering of smaller crowns, cousins and uncles and nephews holding the thrones of Europe, like a single household holding the rooms of a single great house. A family ruled the world, and yet, when the world caught fire, a family could not save it. The bonds were real. The affection, in its awkward royal way, had been real, and it counted for nothing at all against the tides that had risen beneath them. The alliances and the mobilizations, and the great cold logic of the thing, which took no notice of who loved whom, and asked only that the trains run, and the men march, and the guns be fed. And then, under the unbearable weight of it, the first of the 3 great thrones began to give way, and it was the throne of the cousin in the middle, the gentle one, the one whose face was so like the English king's, that strangers had mistaken the one for the other. Russia had gone into the war, vast and seemingly unshakable, and Russia bled as no other nation bled. Army after army poured into the furnace, until the strain reached down past the front and into the cities, into the bread queues and the cold factories, and the hearts of the soldiers themselves. And in the March of 1917, the thing that no one had quite believed could happen, happened. Nicholas II, emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, set down his crown. 300 years of the House of Romanov, 3 centuries of that one family, upon that one throne, ended in a railway carriage on a siding, in a few quiet strokes of a pen, with the snow still on the ground. The full weight of that fall, and all the sorrow that came after it, belongs to another telling, a companion to this one, and we will not walk that road tonight. For now let it rest simply as this. The first of the cousins was no longer a Tsar. He was a private man in the keeping of others, with his wife and his 5 children about him, and a future that had suddenly gone dark and uncertain. Hold that gently and set it down, and turn with me back toward the west. For across the sea, in Britain, the war was working its own strange transformation, not upon the throne itself, which stood firm, but upon its name. 4 years of slaughter had turned the feeling of the ordinary people savagely, bitterly, against everything German. The word itself had become a curse in the mouth. Shops with German names had their windows broken. Families that had lived quiet and English for generations found themselves suddenly suspect for the sound of their surname. Even the very breed of dog was renamed. So deep and so unreasoning had the tide of feeling run. And in the midst of all this stood an awkward and inconvenient truth, one that the king himself could not pretend away, for it was his own. The royal family of Britain, that most English of institutions, bore a German name. The house was the house of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a long, ornate, unmistakably German name, inherited through Prince Albert, the beloved German consort of the old Queen, the grandmother of them all. In peacetime, it had been a matter of no consequence, a curiosity of genealogy. In wartime, with the enemy's shells falling, and the enemy's own ruler, a first cousin of the king, it had become a danger. And so George V did a quiet and a decisive thing, the kind of thing that looks small in the doing and proves very large in the outcome. In the summer of 1917, he remade his house. He cast off the German name and the German titles that clung to his family like an old coat that no longer fit the weather, and he took instead a name drawn from the oldest and most English ground he could find, the name of the great grey castle on the Thames where kings had lived since the age of the Conqueror. He declared that his house and all its descendants would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor. It was a very English name, chosen for a very old and very German-descended family, and it was chosen, plainly and frankly, in order to survive. When the German cousin across the lines heard of it, he is said to have joked in his sharp way that he looked forward to a performance of that famous English play, The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. But it was no joke to the man who had done it. It was an act of shelter, a lowering of the head against a storm, a king's cold, clear reckoning of what his throne could carry and what it could not. And that same cold, clear reckoning, that same instinct for the survival of the house above all things, was about to be put to a far harder and far more terrible test. For here we come to the hardest beat of all, the one that has troubled every teller of this story, and troubles it still. After Nicholas fell, in those first uncertain weeks when he was a prisoner but not yet in danger, when the new men in Russia did not yet know what to do with the family they held, there came quietly an offer. The deposed Tsar and his wife and his children might be given refuge in Britain. They might come across the sea to the country of his cousin, to safety, to the keeping of Georgie, the cousin who looked so like him that in their youth, dressed alike, they had been taken for twins. Imagine what that offer meant. Held up against the dark, a ship, a passage, a quiet house somewhere in the English countryside, an ordinary life, the children growing up, the whole family together and alive and out of the reach of whatever was coming. For a few days it hung there, a door standing open, a way through, and then the door was closed. The offer was taken back, withdrawn, allowed to die. For a long time afterward, when this story was told, the blame for that withdrawal was laid upon the British government of the day, upon its ministers and its prime minister, as though the king himself had wished to save his cousin, and had been overruled by cautious politicians. It was a gentler story, and it let the family off, and for many years it stood. But the historical record has since shifted, as records sometimes do when the private papers are opened and the letters are read at last, and it now appears that the truth ran the other way. It now appears that it was George V himself who pressed for the invitation to be withdrawn, George who grew frightened and pressed and would not let it rest until the door was shut. He was frightened, and one must try to understand the shape of his fear if one is to judge him fairly. His own country was seething. The mood was ugly against the war, against the great and the titled, against kings and the whole idea of kings. Across Europe a throne had just fallen, and here he was being asked to bring onto English soil an autocrat, a fallen Tsar, the very emblem of the kind of rule that the angry crowds despised, and to shelter him, and to name him cousin. He looked at that, and he was afraid, not for his cousin, but for himself, for his own throne, for the house he had only just that summer renamed in order to save it. And he chose the house. He chose the throne. He turned his face from the cousin, who looked like his twin. Now we must be careful and honest even here, at the very lowest point, for the exact weight of George's own responsibility is a thing that historians still weigh and still debate, and no one can lay it out to the last ounce. The government had its own fears and its own reasons. The situation in Russia was tangled and moving fast, and whether any refuge could truly have been arranged in time, whether the men who held the family would truly have let them go, no one can now say for certain. It may be that the door was never as open as it looked, but this much seems clear, and it is clear enough to break the heart, that when the door was closing, the king did not throw his weight against it. He let it close. He may even have helped it close. The fear of revolution had outweighed the bonds of blood, and so we are left, at the end of this part of the story, with that image, and it is the hardest image of all, harder than any battlefield. A family ruled the world, 3 cousins upon 3 thrones, bound by blood and childhood, and the small soft names they had called each other on the summer lawns. A family ruled the world, and when the fire came, a family could not save it. And worse, far worse, when the moment came that one of them might have reached across and pulled the others from the flames, the reaching hand drew back. Cousin turned from cousin. The one who might have opened the door chose instead to guard his own house. Picture it gently as the light goes down on 1917 and moves on into 1918. One throne already fallen, and its master a prisoner in a far cold country, the offered refuge withdrawn, the sea between them uncrossable now, another throne, the German one, shaking harder with every month the war dragged on, and the third, the English one, standing saved, renamed, its master having made the terrible choices that a man makes to keep his crown. 3 cousins still alive in that quiet last winter of the war, with the worst of the reckoning still ahead of them, and the door already softly closed. And so we come, gently, to the end of it, to the quiet that settles over a battlefield, when the guns have at last gone silent, and to the strange hushed reckoning that follows when the world lifts its head and looks around and finds that so much of what it had always known is simply no longer there. Picture the 11th of November in the year 1918, the hour when the armistice took hold and the firing stopped along a line of trenches that had scarred the face of Europe for more than 4 years, and picture, if you can, the silence that came down over those fields, a silence so complete after so long a roar that men are said to have wept at the sound of it, or at the absence of sound, not quite believing that it could be over. It was over. And in the stillness that followed, as the smoke thinned and the winter came on, it became slowly, staggeringly clear just how much the storm had carried away. For this was not merely the end of a war, it was the end of a world. By the close of that year, 4 great empires that had stood for centuries, that had seemed as fixed and permanent as the mountains, had fallen, one after another, like great trees in a gale. The Russian Empire gone, the German Empire gone, the Empire of Austria and Hungary, that old patchwork of crowns and kingdoms ruled from Vienna, broken apart into pieces, and the Ottoman Empire, which had endured for 600 years, which had ruled from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia, dissolving now into memory. 4 thrones, 4 dynasties, 4 ancient orders of the world, swept away in the space of a single autumn. The crowned heads of Europe, the emperors and the kings who had gathered so often in their sashes, and their medals for the weddings and the funerals of their vast interrelated family, found themselves, many of them, without countries to rule, without crowns to wear, blown from their thrones by the very war they had failed to prevent. An entire way of ordering the world of empires and emperors that had lasted, in one form or another, since before anyone living could remember, was ending, quietly, in the cold, while the ink dried on the armistice. And of the 3 cousins who had stood at the centre of it, the king and the Kaiser and the Tsar, who had ruled between them the greatest empires on the earth, and could not, for all their power, stop the catastrophe from coming. Of those 3, let us now trace how it ended, and what became of each, for their 3 fates laid side by side tell the whole of the story in miniature. Nicholas II, the Tsar of all the Russias, was already gone. He had fallen first, and he had fallen furthest. You will remember, from earlier in our long telling, or you will already know it, in that quiet way, one knows the saddest parts of history, how it ended for him, in the summer of that same year, in a cellar, in a house in the depths of Siberia, in the July of 1918, how he was taken there, and his wife with him, and his daughters, and his gentle, sickly young son, and how none of them came out again. We will not walk back down into that cellar tonight. The door to that room we may leave closed, and only stand outside it for a moment, in the dark, and be quiet. It is enough to say that the cousin who had signed his telegrams, Nicky, the cousin who had exchanged those last desperate cables in the final days before the war, pleading in the language of the nursery for a peace that neither of them could any longer command. This cousin was the first of the 3 to die, and he died not as an emperor but as a prisoner in a far country with his children around him. And it is enough to say, and to say gently, that in the year before that cellar, when the Tsar had already lost his throne and needed only a refuge, a place of safety, an open door somewhere in the family, It was to England that his people looked, and to his cousin the king. And that door, after a hesitation, was allowed to close. He was the cousin who might have been saved, and was not. That too we may set down softly, and leave, and carry with us as we go. Wilhelm II, the German Kaiser, met a different fate, and a stranger one. For Germany, in that same November, was collapsing from within, the army spent, the sailors mutinying, the streets filling, the old order crumbling faster than anyone could shore it up. And the emperor who had loved his uniforms and his warships, who had commanded the mightiest army in all of Europe and had rattled the peace of the continent for 30 years, with his restlessness and his grievances and his need to be seen, found that there was, quite suddenly, no place left for him at all. He abdicated. He gave up the throne of Germany and the throne of Prussia with it. And in the grey early morning, he crossed the border, in a train, into the neutral Netherlands, into exile, and he never saw his country again. And now picture the long afterward of that man's life, for it is one of the quietest and strangest endings in all this story. Picture the Kaiser, who had held the fate of nations in his hand, settling at last into a modest country house called Doorn, a house among the flat green fields of Holland, with a garden and a stand of trees. And picture him there, year after year, for more than 20 years, an old man in exile, going out into that garden each day to chop wood, felling tree after tree, thousands upon thousands of them over the years, as though he might work the restlessness out of himself, one log at a time. Few visitors came. The world that had once hung upon his every word forgot him, mostly, and moved on. He grew old there and bitter, nursing his grievances in the quiet, an emperor without an empire, a warlord without a war, tending his roses and cutting his wood while the seasons turned over the low Dutch sky. He lived a long time. He lived long enough to see, in the end, a second Germany rise up under a new and darker master, and a second great war break upon the world, and the armies of that new Germany come marching in 1940 into the very Netherlands that had sheltered him. And so the old Kaiser died at last in 1941, in his house at Doorn, in a country by then occupied by Hitler's soldiers, having lived just long enough to watch a second German catastrophe begin. A strange, sad old man, all but forgotten by the world he had once helped to set on fire. And George V, the King of Britain, was the one who remained. Of the 3 cousins, of the 3 thrones, only his was left standing when the smoke cleared. Steady George, dutiful George, the quiet one, the one who had never wanted to shine or to dazzle, who had asked only to do his duty and keep his family and his kingdom safe. George kept his crown. He had done, in the middle of the war, a small and telling thing, a thing that tells you almost everything about how narrowly the surviving throne had to steer. For the royal house of Britain was, by blood and by name, a German house, descended through Victoria's beloved Albert from a line of German princes, and it bore a long German name. And in the middle of a war against Germany, with German airships dropping bombs upon London, and German guns killing British boys by the 100,000, that name had become impossible. And so George, in 1917, quietly set it aside, and took instead the name of an old English castle, and called his house the House of Windsor. It was a small act, a change of a word, and yet in it you can feel the whole desperate labour of survival, the shedding of the German skin, the becoming wholly, unmistakably British, so that the throne might endure while the others fell. And endure it did. George V reigned on through the wreckage of the old world and into the uneasy peace that followed, a steadying, unglamorous presence, until his own quiet death in the January of 1936. And from that throne, the one throne of the 3 that survived the storm, descends, in an unbroken line, the royal family that reigns in Britain to this very day. Every king and queen who has worn that crown since, every royal wedding and every royal funeral the world has watched in the century since the guns fell silent, comes down from steady George, the cousin who kept his footing when the others fell. But hold, for a moment, the quiet irony of it, and the cost that is folded inside it, for George survived, and Wilhelm went into his long exile among the trees, and Nicholas died in the cellar, and it was George, the survivor, the one who kept his throne, who had let that door close on the cousin who needed saving in the year before the end. The two things are not separate, the steadiness that preserved the House of Windsor, the careful instinct that shed the German name and turned away the dangerous, doomed Russian cousin lest his presence stir the wrong passions at home. That same cool instinct for survival was in its way part of the price. George lived and reigned, and his line goes on, and somewhere inside that survival is the shape of Nicky, waiting at a station for a train to England that never came. The one who lasted and the one who was lost were bound together to the very end, as they had been bound together as boys on the summer lawns. And so we begin, gently, to draw the threads together, though the drawing together is not yet finished, and will be left, in a little while, to quieter words than these. Think back once more to where it all began, to the old Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe, who had sat at the centre of this vast family, like the still point of a turning world, and who had married her children and her grandchildren outward into every court and every capital of the continent, into Germany and into Russia and into Greece and Spain and Romania and beyond, threading her blood through every throne, in the deep and gentle belief that a family so joined, cousins to cousins, could never let itself fall into war, that the ties of blood would hold the peace where treaties failed. That was the dream of it. That was the hope she had woven, wedding by wedding, christening by christening, across all the long bright years of the peace. And within a single generation, within the span of the lives of the very grandchildren she had held upon her knee, that same family, ruling those same intertwined empires, had presided over the bloodiest war the world had yet seen, and had lost, in the fury of it, very nearly everything. A family had ruled the world, and a family could not save it. The cousins who had played together as boys, who had worn on each other's uniforms and stood as godfathers to each other's children, had grown into the men who could not, at the last, hold back the storm. And the great web of blood that was meant to bind the continent in peace had bound it, instead, only more tightly to the catastrophe. The empires were gone. The cousins were scattered into the grave and into exile, and into the lonely survival of a single, narrowed throne. And the world that came after would be a colder, harder, more modern thing, a world of republics and revolutions, and new and terrible ideas, a world that no longer believed, as the old queen had believed, that family could hold the peace. And perhaps that is the thing to rest with, here at the end, before the last few words are said. Not a lesson, exactly, and not a verdict, only a wondering in the dark at how close and how far apart those three lives ran, at how the same blood carried one man to a cellar and one to a woodpile in a foreign garden, and one to a throne that outlasted them all, and at how a love and a peace so carefully woven across so many years could come undone so completely and so fast in the hands of the very people who loved each other best. And so we come back, at the very last, to where we began, to the three cousins, and the one great family, and the beautiful idea that a family might hold the peace of the world. It was not a foolish idea. That is the sadness at the heart of it. It was gentle, and it was hopeful, and for a long and golden while, it even seemed to be working, while the cousins visited, and the weddings went on, and the palaces filled with the same familiar faces year after year. But beneath all that warmth, the world had been quietly building something far larger than any family. The alliances, the swelling armies, the war plans scheduled to the very hour, the great grinding machine of the modern age. And when the moment finally came, the men who wore the crowns discovered that they did not, after all, command that machine. They had believed themselves the masters of the world. They learned too late that they had become only its passengers. A family ruled the world, and a family could not save it. Think of them now, one last time, as your eyes grow heavy. Willy, the proud and wounded boy with the withered arm, who wanted so badly to be admired, and who ended his days forgotten in a garden in a foreign country. Nicky, the gentle man, who never wanted a throne at all, gone into the dark of that cellar with everyone he loved beside him. And Georgie, the quiet sailor who kept his crown, and who lived long enough to watch the whole bright world of his childhood swept clean away, the uncles and the cousins and the grandmother, the empires and the certainties, all of it gone, until only his own small renamed house was left standing in the ruins. Of the 3 great thrones, only his survived, and from it descends the family that reigns in Britain to this day. The last of the 3, the House of Windsor, the very English name chosen in the middle of the storm by the one cousin who endured. The little grandmother in black had married her family into every court in Europe, so that the continent might be bound together in peace. And within a single generation, that same family had watched the world it ruled catch fire, and had lost very nearly everything to the flames. The palaces stand mostly empty now, or filled with strangers and the quiet shuffle of visitors. The thrones are gone. Only the photographs remain, the cousins in their uniforms, smiling side by side, in the last long summers before it all came down, and we look at them now, knowing what they themselves could not, that the warmth was real, and that it was not in the end enough. So let them rest now, all 3 of them, and all the vanished kings and queens of that lost and gilded world. Let the old quarrels fall quiet. It is 100 years gone, and more, the telegrams long since filed away in their archives, the empires long since fallen into history, the cousins long since laid down to their rest. And let yourself rest too now, wherever you are, however late the hour has grown where you are lying. There is nothing left to decide tonight, nothing you must hold, nothing at all to fear. The great family is sleeping. The world went on without its kings, as the world does. Close your eyes, the story will keep until the morning. Rest well, you are in good company tonight.